Hello everyone. Tonight I prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Route That Burns. From Marcus Chen. The GPS unit had been acting strange for 3 days straight when I finally decided to replace it. But by then it was already too late to turn back from what it had been showing me. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods up and down the I-95 corridor for nearly 15 years, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every way station, every shortcut between Jacksonville and Boston like the back of my weathered hands. The Garmin mounted on my dashboard had been my faithful companion through countless midnight runs, its blue glow painting my face as familiar routes appeared in crisp detail. But something had changed after that thunderstorm outside of Richmond, where lightning had split the sky so violently that every electronic device in my Peterbilt's cab had flickered, like dying fireflies. The first sign of trouble came during what should have been a routine run from Georgia to Delaware, carrying a load of frozen chicken that needed to reach its destination before dawn. I'd plugged in the delivery address, same as always, watching the screen calculate the familiar path northward, when suddenly new roads began appearing on the display like veins spreading across pale skin. These weren't the interstates I knew by heart, but rather thin lines that seemed to pulse with their own subtle light, weaving through areas that my paper atlases showed as empty forest or abandoned industrial zones. The roads had names that felt wrong on my tongue when I whispered them aloud. Sorrow Creek Parkway, Bleakwood Trail, Whisper Valley Road. At first I dismissed these phantom routes as corrupted data, perhaps damaged by that electrical storm. But curiosity got the better of me when the GPS began insisting these mystery roads would cut 2 hours off my delivery time. The device's voice, usually calm and mechanical, seemed to take on a more urgent tone as it repeatedly suggested I take the next exit toward something called Thornfield Bypass. The rain had started falling again as I passed through North Carolina, each drop striking my windshield with the persistence of tiny fingers tapping against glass, and the hypnotic rhythm of my wipers began to wear down my resistance to trying something new. Against my better judgment, I followed the GPS's directions onto an exit ramp I'd never noticed before. Despite having driven this stretch of highway hundreds of times, the ramp curved away from the interstate's familiar glow, descending into darkness so complete that my headlights seemed to barely penetrate the wall of night ahead. The road surface changed from smooth asphalt to something rougher, older, and I could feel each irregular bump through my steering wheel as the Peterbilt's 18 wheels found their rhythm on this unexpected path. The GPS screen showed my truck as a blue dot moving along the pulsing route, but something about the display began to disturb me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The roads on the screen seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the estimated arrival time kept changing even though I maintained steady speed. More troubling were the small symbols that occasionally appeared alongside the route. Tiny icons that looked like twisted trees, broken buildings, or shapes that might have been vehicles but seemed somehow wrong, as if drawn by someone who had only heard descriptions of cars and trucks but never actually seen them. The forest pressed close on both sides of the narrow road, creating a tunnel effect that made me feel increasingly isolated from the world I knew. My CB radio produced only static, and my cell phone showed no signal bars despite being in an area that should have had excellent coverage. The only sounds were the steady rumble of my diesel engine, the whisper of air through my cab's ventilation system, and the rhythmic thump of windshield wipers fighting the persistent rain. Even my usual country music station had faded to silence, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the soft electronic voice of the GPS providing turn-by-turn directions deeper into this unknown territory. Mile after mile passed without any sign of civilization, no other vehicles, no roadside reflectors, no mile markers to confirm my location. The GPS insisted I was making good time, but something felt fundamentally wrong about the passage of distance and duration. According to my dashboard clock, I'd been driving this mystery route for over an hour, yet the fuel gauge hadn't moved, and the odometer seemed frozen. When I glanced at the GPS screen, I noticed that the map itself appeared to be changing, with new roads branching off from my current path like a living thing growing in real time. The most unsettling realization came when I tried to memorize landmarks for the return trip, only to discover that the landscape seemed to reset itself every few miles. I'd pass a distinctive dead tree or an abandoned barn, then 20 minutes later encounter what appeared to be the exact same structure in the exact same position relative to the road. It was as if I were driving through a loop that disguised itself as forward progress, though the GPS continued to show steady advancement toward my destination. Then I began to notice the other blue dots on the screen, small indicators that suggested other vehicles traveling these phantom roads. They moved in patterns that defied normal traffic flow, sometimes clustering together before separating, occasionally moving in directions that didn't correspond to any roads shown on the display. I found myself wondering who these other travelers might be and what had brought them to these impossible routes that existed somewhere between the margins of reality and navigation data. The temperature inside my cab began to drop despite the heater running at full capacity, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the dashboard lights. Outside, the rain had taken on an odd consistency, striking the windshield with impacts that seemed too heavy for water, too light for hail. When droplets ran down the glass, they left faint traces that reminded me of the residue from touching certain plants, a slight burning sensation that I could somehow feel by proxy, as if the glass itself were transmitting the irritation directly to my nerves. That's when I realized the GPS screen had begun to sting my eyes whenever I looked at it directly. The sensation was subtle at first, like staring at a bright light for too long, but it gradually intensified until every glance at the display brought tears that blurred my vision. The pulsing routes seemed to pulse in sync with the burning sensation, and I began to suspect that the map wasn't just showing me these roads, it was somehow creating them, burning them into existence through the act of observation and belief. The smart thing would have been to pull over, turn around, and find my way back to the interstate. But the road had narrowed to the point where stopping seemed impossible. There were no shoulders, no turnoffs, just the continuous ribbon of broken asphalt stretching ahead into darkness. The GPS estimated only 30 more minutes to reach a major highway that would connect me back to familiar territory, and I decided to trust the device despite every instinct screaming warnings, as if responding to my decision. The other blue dots on the screen began converging on my location, approaching from side roads that I couldn't see in the physical world. The burning sensation in my eyes intensified, and I had to rely increasingly on peripheral vision to monitor the display. Through my tears, I could see the dots growing closer, and I pressed harder on the accelerator despite the dangerous conditions. The climax came when my headlights finally illuminated something ahead. Not the hoped-for highway interchange, but rather a collection of vehicles parked in a rough circle around what might once have been a rest area. As I drew closer, I could see that the cars and trucks were from different eras, ranging from vehicles that looked contemporary to others that appeared decades old. All were empty, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in silent screams. The GPS showed all the blue dots converged at this location, but the screen was burning so brightly now that looking at it felt like staring into a flame. I didn't stop to investigate, instead gunning the engine and swerving around the perimeter of the gathering. As I passed, I caught glimpses of license plates from states that didn't exist and bumper stickers advertising businesses that had never been real. In my mirrors, I could see the abandoned vehicles beginning to move, their headlights flickering to life as they slowly turned to follow my trajectory. The chase that followed felt like it lasted hours, though according to my frozen dashboard clock, no time passed at all. The pursuing vehicles maintained their distance but never gave up, their lights creating a constellation of threat in my mirrors. The GPS continued providing directions in its increasingly urgent voice, guiding me through turns that seemed impossible, over bridges that spanned empty air, around curves that folded back on themselves in ways that hurt to contemplate. Finally, blessedly, I saw the glow of interstate lighting ahead, and the GPS announced that I was approaching my exit to rejoin I-95. As I climbed the ramp back toward familiar territory, the pursuing lights faded. The burning sensation in my eyes subsided, and my radio crackled back to life with a country song about highways and freedom. When I checked the GPS screen, it showed only normal roads again, with my blue dot moving along the standard route I'd traveled countless times before. I completed my delivery on schedule, though I couldn't shake the feeling that more time had passed than my instruments indicated. Later that morning, at a truck stop outside of Baltimore, I bought a new GPS unit and threw the old one in a dumpster. The static between. From Marcus Kane, the CB radio crackled to life as I rolled past the Missouri state line, its familiar static filling the cab of my Peterbilt like an old friend greeting me after a long absence. I'd been running this route from Kansas City to Memphis for the better part of 15 years, and that old Cobra 29 had been my companion through countless lonely nights on the interstate. The orange glow of its display cut through the darkness, a small beacon of connection in the vast emptiness that stretched beyond my headlights. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first heard the transmission that would change everything. The weather had been clear when I'd started my run, but somewhere around mile marker 127, a light drizzle had begun to kiss my windshield, creating those hypnotic patterns that could lull a driver into dangerous complacency. I was nursing my third cup of truck stop coffee, the bitter brew keeping my eyes focused on the ribbon of asphalt ahead, when the voice came through the speaker with unusual clarity. "Eastbound Peterbilt, you got your ears on?" The voice was calm, professional, with just the hint of urgency that experienced drivers use when they need to pass along important information. "This is Moondog in the Kenworth about 5 miles ahead of your position." I keyed the microphone, grateful for the company. "Yeah, Moondog, this is Nighthawk. Go ahead with your traffic." "Nighthawk, you'll want to keep your eyes peeled coming up here around mile 135. Got a real nasty situation developing. Looks like a four-wheeler lost control in this weather. Spun sideways across both eastbound lanes. Highway patrol ain't made it out here yet, and I'm trying to flag traffic around it." The information sent a familiar chill through my system, the kind of heightened awareness that comes with years of experience on the road. Weather-related accidents were nothing new, but they could turn deadly fast if drivers weren't warned in time. I eased off the accelerator slightly, my eyes scanning the darkness ahead for any sign of trouble. "Much obliged for the heads up, Moondog. You need me to call it in to the authorities?" "Negative, Nighthawk. Already got that handled. Just keep it between the lines and take it easy through here." I clicked the mic twice in acknowledgement and settled back into my seat, grateful for the warning. The CB radio had saved my bacon more times than I could count, and drivers looking out for each other was what made the difference between getting home safe and becoming another statistic on the evening news. The miles ticked by slowly as I approached the danger zone, but as I crested the hill before mile marker 135, my headlights illuminated nothing but empty pavement, wet with rain but completely clear of any obstruction. The confusion hit me like a physical weight in my chest. I keyed the mic again, my voice carrying a note of uncertainty that I didn't like hearing in myself. "Moondog, this is Nighthawk. I'm passing through mile 135 now, and I'm not seeing any accident out here. Everything looks clear as glass." Silence answered me, broken only by the soft hiss of static that seemed somehow different now, more intentional, as if something was listening from within the white noise. I tried again, scanning through the channels, but Moondog's distinctive voice had vanished completely from the airwaves. The next incident happened 3 nights later, somewhere in the rolling hills of Tennessee. I was pulling a load of automotive parts destined for a plant outside Nashville, making good time despite a stubborn fog that had settled over the highway like a gray blanket. The CB had been quiet most of the night, just the occasional chatter from local drivers and the distant conversations of truckers heading in the opposite direction. Southbound big truck approaching mile marker 78, you copy? The voice was different this time, younger, with a slight southern accent that seemed genuine enough. This is Roadrunner in the blue Freightliner. I shifted in my seat, working out a kink in my back as I reached for the microphone. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:47 a.m., and I was grateful for any distraction from the monotonous rhythm of the road. Yeah, Roadrunner, this is Nighthawk. Go ahead. Nighthawk, you're gonna want to slow it way down coming through here. Got a real mess in the southbound lanes. Looks like a reefer truck jackknife trying to avoid something in the road. Trailers blocking most of the right lane, and there's debris scattered everywhere. I'm sitting here with my hazards on trying to warn traffic. The familiar tingle of adrenaline coursed through my veins as I began downshifting, my Jake brake adding its distinctive rumble to the symphony of sounds in my cab. Jackknife trucks were serious business, especially in foggy conditions where visibility was already compromised. I'd seen too many secondary accidents caused by drivers who couldn't see trouble until it was too late. Roger that, Roadrunner. How's it looking for getting around? Can you see if the left lane is clear? Affirmative on the left lane, Nighthawk. Just take it real easy and keep your four-ways on. This fog's got everything locked down tight. I activated my hazard lights and reduced my speed to a crawl, my eyes straining to penetrate the thick curtain of mist that seemed to swallow my headlight beams. The tension in my shoulders increased with every tenth of a mile, expecting at any moment to see the twisted metal and scattered glass that Roadrunner had described. But as I approached and passed mile marker 78, the highway remained clear, the fog revealing nothing more dangerous than wet pavement and the occasional reflective highway sign. Roadrunner, this is Nighthawk. I just passed through mile 78 and I'm not seeing any accident out here. You sure about your location? The response came back immediately, but something in the voice had changed, a subtle shift in tone that made the hair on my arms stand up. Oh, you missed it, Nighthawk. You definitely missed it. But don't worry, there'll be another one along soon enough. The transmission ended with a burst of static that seemed to echo in my cab long after the actual sound had faded. I grabbed the mic with hands that weren't quite steady, cycling through every channel on the radio, but Roadrunner had vanished as completely as Moondog before him. After the third phantom warning, I began to suspect that something far stranger than coincidence was playing out on the airwaves. The voice that time belonged to someone calling himself Diesel Dan, and he'd warned me about a multi-car pileup that supposedly stretched across both lanes of Interstate 40 near Little Rock. Like the others before it, the accident existed only in the transmission, evaporating like morning mist when I reached the location he'd specified. I started keeping a log, writing down the details of each phantom warning in a small notebook I kept in my door pocket. The pattern that emerged chilled me more than I wanted to admit. Each voice was different, each accident description unique and detailed, but they all shared certain characteristics. The warnings always came between 2 and 4 in the morning, always during weather conditions that reduced visibility, and always described accidents that would require extreme caution and reduced speed. It was the fourth incident that finally revealed the true horror of what I was experiencing. I was running empty back toward Kansas City, enjoying the lighter feel of my truck without a trailer, when the CB crackled to life around 2:30 a.m. This time, the voice belonged to someone calling himself Cherokee, and he sounded older, more weathered, like he'd been running the highways since before I was born. Eastbound Peterbilt running light, you got a copy on Cherokee? I keyed the mic, but my response carried a note of wariness that hadn't been there in the earlier encounters. Yeah, Cherokee, I hear you. This is Nighthawk. Nighthawk, you're gonna want to shut it down for a few minutes here around mile marker 203. Got a real tragedy developing. Looks like a whole family in a minivan. Must have fallen asleep at the wheel. Van's upside down in the median, and from what I can see, it doesn't look good. Emergency crews are en route, but it's gonna take them a while to sort this mess out. The description sent ice water through my veins. Not because of its content, but because I recognized something in Cherokee's voice. Something that took me several seconds to place. It was compassion. Genuine human concern for the victims he was describing, and it sounded absolutely authentic. If this was another phantom transmission, the performance was flawless. Cherokee, you need any help out there? I've got some first aid training. Negative, Nighthawk. Best thing you can do is just keep your distance and let the professionals handle it. This is going to be a long night for everybody involved. The breathing cab. From Marcus Vale. The sleeper berth in my Kenworth has always run warm, but tonight it feels like I'm crawling into something alive. I've been hauling freight across the Midwest for 15 years, and this old girl has been my home away from home for the last 8 of those. Her engine purrs like a contented cat even when she's resting, and the diesel heater has a habit of kicking on whether I ask it to or not. But this warmth pressing against my back through the thin mattress, seeping through the cab walls like a slow exhale, this is something different entirely. The truck stop outside Amarillo sits under a canopy of stars so bright they seem to pulse with their own heartbeat. Most of the other drivers have already settled in for their mandatory rest periods. Their rigs lined up like sleeping giants in neat rows across the asphalt lot. The fluorescent lights mounted on tall poles cast everything in that familiar sickly yellow glow, creating long shadows that stretch and bend between the trucks. A light wind carries the scent of diesel fuel and the distant aroma of the diner's coffee, mixing with something else I can't quite place, something organic and warm. I'd pulled in here around 11:30, my logbook showing I had exactly 14 hours before I could legally get back on the road. The load of automotive parts I'm hauling to Phoenix isn't urgent, but the deadline is tight enough that I can't afford any delays. Sleep comes easier in familiar places, and I've used this particular truck stop dozens of times over the years. The showers are clean, the food is decent, and the lot is well lit enough to discourage the kind of trouble that can find a lone driver in the middle of nowhere. But as I settle back against the pillows in my sleeper berth, pulling the thin blanket up to my chest, the walls around me seem to radiate heat like they're powered by something more than just the standard heating system. I reach out and press my palm against the panel beside my head, feeling the metal warm to the touch, almost feverish. The sensation reminds me of touching someone's forehead when they're running a high temperature, that kind of heat that speaks of something working too hard beneath the surface. The engine has been off for 20 minutes now, and the auxiliary power unit that runs the sleeper's climate control is humming quietly in its usual rhythm. Nothing sounds different. Nothing looks out of place, but the warmth continues to build around me like I'm being slowly wrapped in an invisible embrace. My logbook lies open on the small shelf beside the bed, the pages filled with my careful notations of miles driven, fuel stops, and rest periods, all the mundane details that keep me legal and keep food on my table back home in Missouri. I close my eyes and try to focus on the familiar sounds that usually lull me to sleep. The distant hum of highway traffic on Interstate 40 creates a steady white noise backdrop. Somewhere across the lot, another driver's auxiliary unit kicks on with a mechanical wheeze, and a semi pulling a refrigerated trailer rumbles to life as someone begins their next leg of a long journey. These are the sounds of my world, the mechanical lullabies that have sung me to sleep in truck stops from coast to coast. But underneath these familiar noises, I begin to notice something else. Something so subtle at first that I convince myself I'm imagining it. The walls of the sleeper berth seem to be expanding and contracting ever so slightly, like the gentle rise and fall of breathing. When I press my ear against the panel, I can hear what might be air moving through the ventilation system, or it might be something else entirely. Something that sounds almost like a slow, deep inhalation followed by an equally measured exhalation. The warmth continues to intensify, and I find myself pulling off the blanket entirely, then unzipping my jacket and laying it aside. The temperature gauge on the climate control unit shows normal readings, but the air inside the sleeper feels thick and humid, almost tropical. When I breathe in, it tastes faintly metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm, but sweeter somehow, with an underlying flavor that reminds me of copper pennies mixed with something organic and rich. I sit up and check the outside temperature display on my dashboard. 52 degrees under clear skies. Exactly what the weather service predicted for this part of Texas tonight. But here in my sleeper berth, the air has to be pushing 80, maybe 85 degrees and getting warmer by the minute. Sweat begins to form along my hairline and between my shoulder blades, and I can feel my shirt starting to stick to my skin. The logical part of my mind runs through the possibilities. Maybe the heating system has malfunctioned, stuck on high with a broken thermostat. Maybe there's an electrical short somewhere, causing wires to overheat. Maybe the auxiliary power unit is working too hard, generating excess heat as it tries to maintain power to the sleeper systems. All reasonable explanations for what should be a simple mechanical problem with a straightforward solution. But when I place both hands flat against the wall that separates the sleeper berth from the rest of the cab, the heat feels like it's coming from something living, something that responds to my touch by growing even warmer. The metal panel seems to pulse gently against my palms, and I swear I can feel what might be a heartbeat, slow and steady and impossibly large, thrumming through the structure of the truck itself. I grab my flashlight from the shelf and slide out of the bunk, crouching in the narrow space between the bed and the cab's back wall. The beam of light reveals nothing unusual about the sleeper's interior, just the same worn upholstery and practical storage compartments I've looked at thousands of times before. But when I run the light along the walls, I notice that the usual condensation you might expect from a malfunctioning heating system is absent. Instead, the surfaces appear dry and slightly flushed, like skin that's been warmed by exercise or fever. The breathing sound becomes more pronounced as I listen, a rhythmic whisper that seems to come from all around me simultaneously. When I hold my breath, I can hear it clearly, a deep and patient inhalation that lasts for nearly 10 seconds, followed by an equally long and measured exhalation. The timing is too regular to be random air movement, too deliberate to be explained by any mechanical system I know. I crawl back onto the bunk and lie still, feeling the warmth pressing up against me from below and surrounding me from all sides. The sensation is not entirely unpleasant, like being held by something vast and protective, but there's an intimacy to it that makes my skin crawl. Whatever is generating this heat knows I'm here, and it's responding to my presence in ways that no truck should be capable of understanding. The walls continue their subtle expansion and contraction, and I realize that I've begun to synchronize my own breathing with the rhythm I'm hearing. When the walls expand, I breathe in. When they contract, I exhale. The pattern is hypnotic and surprisingly soothing, and I feel my heart rate beginning to slow despite the strangeness of the situation. The warmth flows through me like heated honey, relaxing muscles I didn't even know were tense. Minutes pass, or maybe hours. Time seems to move differently inside the breathing sleeper berth, flowing like warm molasses instead of ticking away in discrete seconds and minutes. My eyelids grow heavy despite my growing certainty that something fundamentally wrong is happening around me. The heat has become almost narcotic in its intensity, and my thoughts begin to drift and blur at the edges like photographs left too long in the sun. But then I notice that the truck is rocking, just barely, moving in time with the breathing walls. The motion is gentle, almost nurturing, like being rocked to sleep in someone's arms. Through the small window in the sleeper berth, I can see that the other trucks in the lot remain perfectly still, their bulk dark and motionless under the yellow lights. Only my Kenworth moves with that slow, rhythmic sway, and only my truck radiates the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer like a summer highway. I force myself to sit up, fighting against the drowsiness that wants to pull me down into whatever warm embrace is waiting in the depths of the sleeper berth. My hands are shaking as I reach for my keys, and when I touch the metal, it's almost too hot to hold. The engine turns over immediately, responding with an eagerness that seems almost hungry, and I can feel the whole truck shudder with what might be pleasure as the diesel engine comes alive. Without bothering to secure my logbook or stow my gear properly, I released the parking brake and eased the truck forward, heading for the exit of the truck stop with a desperation I don't fully understand. In the mirrors, I can see other drivers emerging from their own sleeper berths, their faces confused and concerned as they watch me leave. But I can't explain to them what I don't understand myself. Can't tell them about walls that breathe and heat that thinks and metal that responds to touch like living flesh. The signal between stations. From Marcus, the CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours as I drove through the Nevada desert. Nothing but the endless ribbon of Interstate 80 stretching ahead of my Peterbilt in the pre-dawn darkness. I'd been hauling freight for nearly 15 years, and these long hauls through the empty spaces of America had become as familiar as breathing. The diesel engine hummed its steady rhythm beneath me, a mechanical lullaby that usually kept me alert through the lonely hours when the rest of the world slept. It was somewhere past 2 in the morning when I decided to fiddle with the radio dial, searching for something to break the monotony of wind noise and engine rumble. The AM stations were mostly dead air or distant signals fading in and out like whispers, but as I turned the knob slowly through the frequencies, I caught something unusual. A clear, crisp voice emerged from the speakers, so sudden and distinct it made me jump slightly in my seat. "Welcome back to Midnight Tales," the voice said, smooth and cultured with just a hint of theatrical flair. "I'm your host, Vincent Cross, and tonight we're sharing stories from the other side of the veil, tales that blur the line between the living and the dead." The voice had an old-fashioned quality to it, like something from radio's golden age, complete with perfect diction and dramatic pauses that seemed choreographed for maximum effect. I glanced at the radio display, but it showed only static, where the frequency should be, as if the signal existed somewhere between the official channels. The story that followed was a classic ghost tale about a lighthouse keeper who continued tending his beacon long after drowning in a storm. Vincent Cross told it with such conviction and atmospheric detail that I found myself completely absorbed, the miles passing unnoticed as I listened to his rich baritone voice paint pictures of fog-shrouded shores and spectral lights. When the story ended, Cross announced a brief intermission and soft organ music filled the cab. I tried adjusting the tuner to see if I could find the station's official frequency, but any movement of the dial resulted in immediate static. Only when I returned to that mysterious spot between stations did Vincent Cross's voice return, clear as if he were sitting right beside me in the passenger seat. "Our next tale comes from a truck driver named Samuel," Cross announced after the music faded. Samuel was hauling a load through the Montana mountains when he encountered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundary between this world and the next. Something cold settled in my stomach as I realized the coincidence. I was a truck driver, listening to a story about a truck driver, broadcast on a frequency that shouldn't exist. The story that followed was uncomfortably familiar in its details. Samuel drove a Peterbilt, just like mine. He was hauling freight through an isolated stretch of highway when his CB radio picked up a mysterious station. As Vincent Cross continued the narrative, I felt goosebumps rising along my arms. Samuel's truck was the same model and year as mine. His route, his cargo, even his coffee preference, all matched my own circumstances with unnerving precision. Samuel began to notice that the stories being told seemed to know things about him. Cross continued, his voice taking on an ominous undertone. Personal things, private things, details about his life that no stranger should possess. I reached for the radio dial with a trembling hand, but hesitated. Part of me was terrified to hear what came next, while another part was magnetically drawn to the unfolding narrative that seemed to be peeling back the layers of my own existence. Cross described how Samuel's hand shook as he gripped the steering wheel, how his coffee had grown cold in the cup holder, how he kept glancing at the CB radio with growing unease. Every detail matched my current state exactly. as if the mysterious host were somehow observing me through the airwaves. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly around my truck, but I felt increasingly trapped, as though invisible walls were closing in despite the vast open space. Samuel discovered that each story told on the Midnight Tales program featured someone listening to the very same broadcast. Cross continued, his voice now carrying an unmistakable note of menace. Each listener became part of the show, their experience woven into the fabric of stories that would be told to future audiences. The radio signal, you see, didn't just share ghost stories, it collected them. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine noise. I wanted to turn off the radio to break whatever connection had formed between myself and this impossible broadcast, but my hand seemed frozen inches from the dial. Cross was now describing my current paralysis with scientific precision, explaining how Samuel found himself unable to break free from the signal's influence, drawn inexorably into the web of supernatural narrative. The truth, Samuel learned, was that Vincent Cross had been broadcasting his midnight tales for far longer than should have been possible. The voice continued, and now I could hear something else beneath the polished delivery, something hollow and echoing as if the words were coming from a great distance. Cross had died 40 years earlier, but his passion for collecting and sharing ghost stories had proven stronger than death itself. From his studio in whatever realm exists beyond our own, he continued to broadcast, reaching out to lonely travelers in the dark hours before dawn. The highway ahead began to blur as my eyes watered with strain and fear. I tried blinking hard, focusing on the white lines that divided the asphalt, but Cross's voice continued its relentless narration of my every action and emotion. He described my growing panic, my desperate need to escape, my dawning realization that I had become trapped in a story being told to some future listener who might be driving through their own dark night. Samuel understood that his only chance of escape was to break the pattern, Cross announced, and for the first time, his voice seemed to address me directly rather than describing me in the third person. He would need to act quickly and decisively before becoming permanently woven into the tapestry of tales that Vincent Cross had been collecting for decades. With tremendous effort, I forced my hand toward the radio. The motion felt like moving through thick syrup, every inch a struggle against some invisible resistance that wanted to keep me connected to the broadcast. Cross began speaking faster, now his cultured voice taking on a desperate edge as he described my attempt to break free. The static around his signal grew louder and more aggressive, filling the cab with a sound like angry whispers. Samuel's hand approached the radio dial, Cross narrated urgently. But he hesitated, knowing that dozens of previous listeners had attempted the same escape and failed. Their stories lived on in the broadcast, eternal warnings to future victims who would find themselves driving through the dark, searching for something to break the monotony of the long road ahead. I could see my reflection in the windshield, pale and frightened, overlaid against the dark desert landscape. Behind my reflection, impossibly, I glimpsed what looked like an old radio studio, complete with vintage microphones and a figure in a dated suit speaking earnestly into the equipment. Vincent Cross looked exactly as his voice suggested, distinguished and theatrical, but his eyes held a hunger that chilled me more than the desert's pre-dawn cold. Fighting against the paralyzing influence of the broadcast, I managed to grasp the radio dial. Cross's voice rose to a crescendo as he described the moment, his words coming so fast they began to overlap and echo, creating a cascade of narrative that threatened to overwhelm my senses entirely. I twisted the dial hard to the right and Vincent Cross's voice cut off abruptly, replaced by the blessed silence of dead air. For several minutes, I drove in complete quiet, except for the engine's rumble and my own ragged breathing. Dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon, painting the desert in subtle shades of pink and gold. The familiar landscape looked welcoming now, no longer the alien environment it had seemed while under the influence of Cross's impossible broadcast. I tried to convince myself that the entire experience had been a product of exhaustion and, too much caffeine, a hallucination born from long hours of solitary driving. But as the sun climbed higher and traffic began to appear on the highway, I couldn't shake the memory of Vincent Cross's final words, spoken just as I reached for the dial. He had smiled that hungry smile and said, "Thank you for the wonderful story, Marcus. Samuel's tale will make an excellent addition to tomorrow night's broadcast." I never gave him my name. The CB radio's display still shows nothing but static where that signal used to be, and I've never been able to find that frequency again. But sometimes in the deepest hours of night when I'm driving through empty country with only the stars for company, I hear the faint sound of organ music drifting from the speakers and a cultured voice saying, "Welcome back to Midnight Tales. Tonight we have a special story about a truck driver named Marcus who thought he had escaped, but never really understood that some stories never truly end." The Living Road. From Marcus Chen, the Interstate 47 runs through Nevada like a scar across the desert, connecting nothing to nowhere in particular, and that's exactly why I chose it for my midnight runs. 23 years behind the wheel of my Freightliner Cascadia, and I've learned that the loneliest roads pay the best when you're hauling sensitive cargo that needs to travel without questions. The electronic shipment in my trailer was worth more than my house, and the client paid triple rates for discretion and speed across the empty stretches where civilization becomes just a memory painted in distant lights. The autumn night was crisp and clear when I pulled onto that desolate stretch. My dashboard clock reading 2:47 a.m. as the last truck stop faded into my mirrors. The highway ahead stretched endlessly into darkness, illuminated only by my headlights cutting through the cool desert air. The engine's steady hum filled the cab with familiar comfort, while classic rock played softly on the radio, keeping me company through the vast emptiness that surrounded the asphalt ribbon beneath my wheels. For the first hour, everything felt normal in that meditative way that long-haul driving can be. The white lines flowed past in hypnotic rhythm while my truck maintained a steady 70 miles per hour, eating up the miles toward my delivery deadline in Salt Lake City. The desert stretched away on both sides, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree standing sentinel against the star-filled sky. My coffee stayed warm in the thermos. My CB radio crackled with distant conversations from other drivers somewhere out in the night, and the pavement rolled smooth and true beneath my 18 wheels. It was around mile marker 247 when I first noticed something unusual about the road surface, the steady vibration that every trucker knows by heart. That constant feedback from tires on asphalt seemed to have developed an odd rhythm. Instead of the consistent drone I expected, there was a subtle pulsing like a heartbeat felt through the steering wheel and seat. At first I attributed it to tire wear or maybe an alignment issue, but the sensation was too regular, too organic to be mechanical in nature. I reduced my speed slightly and paid closer attention to the road ahead. The asphalt looked normal in my headlight beams, the same weathered gray surface marked with the usual cracks and repairs that characterize any aging highway. But the pulsing continued, growing more pronounced as I drove deeper into this isolated section of desert road. The rhythm seemed to match something primal, something that reminded me of breathing, as if the earth itself was drawing slow, steady breaths beneath the pavement. The sensation became more noticeable over the next few miles, and I found myself unconsciously matching my own breathing to the strange rhythm coming up through my truck. Each pulse seemed to last about 4 seconds, followed by a brief pause, then another 4-second pulse like the chest of a sleeping giant rising and falling with peaceful regularity. My CB radio had gone quiet, no longer picking up those distant voices that usually provided comfort during these lonely night runs. As I crested a small hill around mile marker 253, my headlights illuminated something that made me ease off the accelerator and lean forward in my seat. The road ahead appeared to be moving, not in any violent or dramatic way, but with subtle undulations that suggested movement beneath the surface. The white center line seemed to flex slightly with each pulse, and the entire highway surface appeared to rise and fall by perhaps an inch or two, as if the asphalt was merely a thin skin stretched over something vast and alive. I brought my truck to a gradual stop on the shoulder, engine idling while I tried to process what I was seeing. The movement was definitely there, clearly visible in my headlight beams as the road surface continued its slow, rhythmic breathing. The desert around me was completely silent except for my engine's rumble and the soft hiss of air brakes. No wind stirred the sagebrush, no night birds called from the darkness, and the usual symphony of insects that populate desert evenings was conspicuously absent. Stepping down from my cab, I approached the edge of the pavement with cautious steps. The asphalt felt solid enough under my boots, but I could definitely sense the movement now. A gentle rising and falling that came up through my feet with each mysterious breath. Kneeling down, I placed my palm flat against the road surface and felt warmth that seemed too intense for pavement that should have cooled in the desert night. The warmth pulsed with the same rhythm as the movement, as if blood was flowing through arteries deep beneath the highway. Standing back up, I looked along the road in both directions and realized that the breathing motion extended as far as my lights could reach. This wasn't some localized phenomenon caused by underground springs or geological activity. The entire highway appeared to be alive, drawing breath after breath with patient regularity while maintaining the illusion of being normal pavement. The white lines painted down the center and along the edges flexed with each breath, stretching and contracting like veins visible through translucent skin. Getting back into my truck, I tried to radio for help, but my CB picked up only static, and my cell phone showed no signal bars, despite usually getting decent coverage along this route. The isolation felt complete now, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket as I sat in my idling truck, trying to decide whether to proceed across this breathing highway or attempt to turn around and find an alternate route. My delivery deadline pressed against my consciousness, but the idea of driving across what might be something alive and sleeping filled me with growing unease. I decided to proceed slowly, dropping my speed to barely 20 miles per hour as I pulled back onto the highway. The sensation of driving on something alive was unmistakable now, each breath lifting my truck slightly before letting it settle back down. My trailer followed behind, and I could feel the entire rig rising and falling with the road's mysterious respiration. The rhythmic movement was almost soothing at first, like being rocked in a giant cradle, but gradually I began to notice that the breaths were becoming deeper, more pronounced. By mile marker 260, the breathing had intensified enough that my truck was rising and falling by several feet with each cycle. My cargo shifted slightly in the trailer despite being properly secured, and I had to maintain a constant grip on the steering wheel to keep tracking straight as the road surface undulated beneath me. The engine worked harder now, alternately climbing upslope as the road inhaled and accelerating downslope as it exhaled, while my headlights cast weird shadows that danced with each breath cycle. The radio suddenly crackled to life with a sound that made my blood run cold. Instead of the usual trucker chatter or country music from distant stations, I heard what sounded like a deep, resonant breathing that perfectly matched the rhythm of the road beneath me. The sound filled my cab, seeming to come from all directions at once, as if my truck had become part of some vast respiratory system. I quickly turned the radio off, but the breathing sound continued, now seeming to emanate from the road itself. That's when I noticed my truck's movements were becoming synchronized with something beyond just the road's breathing. My engine's RPM gauge fluctuated in rhythm with the pulsing, my fuel gauge needle swayed back and forth slightly, and even my speedometer seemed to pulse as if my truck was being integrated into whatever organism lay beneath the highway. The boundary between my mechanical vehicle and the living road was blurring in ways that filled me with claustrophobic panic. Around mile marker 267, the breathing suddenly changed tempo, becoming faster and shallower, like something stirring toward wakefulness. The road surface began to feel less stable, and I could see what looked like cracks forming in the asphalt ahead. Not the normal stress fractures you'd expect on any aging highway, but organic-looking splits that opened and closed with each breath like gills on some massive creature. My truck bounced more violently now as the road's movements became erratic and urgent. I pressed the accelerator harder, desperate to reach the end of this living section of highway before whatever slept beneath it fully awakened. My speedometer climbed back toward 60 as I raced along the increasingly unstable surface, feeling like a parasite running across the skin of some disturbed giant. The breathing sounds grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere around me, and my truck's electrical systems began to flicker in rhythm with the pulsing road. In my mirrors, I could see the highway behind me beginning to buckle more dramatically, the asphalt surface splitting open to reveal glimpses of something dark and wet underneath. The white lines twisted and stretched as the road writhed with increasing agitation, and I realized that my presence, my truck's weight and vibration, had disturbed something that had been peacefully sleeping beneath this remote stretch of desert highway. With my foot pressed firmly to the floor, I pushed my truck as hard as I dared across the increasingly chaotic surface. The engine roared with effort while my cargo bounced and shifted despite the restraints. But gradually I began to see normal, stable pavement ahead in my headlight beams. The fog of memory lane. From Marcus Thompson, the CB radio crackled with static as I guided my Peterbilt through the winding mountain roads of eastern Tennessee. The familiar weight of 20 tons of freight behind me, settling into that comfortable rhythm that comes after 15 years of long-haul driving. It was well past midnight, and the world outside my windshield had dissolved into a thick, luminescent fog that seemed to glow with its own internal light, unlike any weather pattern I'd encountered in all my years on the road. The fog moved strangely too, rolling and churning in ways that defied the gentle mountain breeze, forming shapes and shadows that appeared almost deliberate in their dance across my headlight beams. I'd been driving this particular route between Knoxville and Asheville for the better part of a decade, knew every curve and straightaway like the lines on my own weathered hands. But tonight something felt different about the familiar asphalt beneath my wheels. The fog had descended so suddenly that I hadn't even seen it coming. One moment driving under clear star-studded skies, the next moment enveloped in this strange, shifting mist that seemed to press against my windows with an almost tactile presence. My diesel engine hummed its steady song, a comforting constant in the surreal landscape that had transformed around me, while the soft glow of my dashboard instruments created a small pocket of normalcy in the otherworldly scene. As I navigated a particularly sharp bend, something in the fog caught my attention. A flicker of movement that seemed too purposeful to be random. I slowed my rig, downshifting carefully as the air brakes hissed their familiar sigh and peered through the windshield into the swirling mist. For just a moment, the fog seemed to part like curtains on a stage, and I found myself looking at what appeared to be a perfect recreation of the truck stop where I'd started my career all those years ago, complete with the flickering neon sign that spelled out Mel's Diner in faded red letters. The detail was impossibly precise, down to the rust stains on the fuel pumps and the cracked asphalt where weeds had pushed through in defiant green patches. I blinked hard, certain that fatigue was playing tricks with my perception. But when I opened my eyes, the scene remained crystal clear within the fog's embrace. More unsettling still, I could see a younger version of myself climbing down from the cab of my first truck, a battered Kenworth that I'd bought used with every penny of my savings and a prayer to whatever deity watches over foolish dreamers. The younger Marcus moved with the eager uncertainty of someone still learning the sacred rhythms of the road, still believing that the highway held nothing but promise and adventure in its endless miles of possibility. The fog shifted again, and the scene changed like pages turning in a photograph album, showing me moments from my driving career that I'd long forgotten or deliberately buried in the deeper recesses of memory. There was the night I'd broken down in a Nebraska snowstorm, sitting in my cold cab for 8 hours until help arrived, learning the hard lesson that the road gives nothing for free. I watched myself from that terrible evening, when I'd called my ex-wife from a payphone in Amarillo, listening to her tell me that she couldn't wait anymore for a husband who loved the highway more than his own home. The conversation that had sealed the fate of our marriage with words as final as a judge's gavel. Each vision in the fog was accompanied by sounds that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. The whistle of wind through my cracked windshield during that blizzard, the hollow echo of my own voice pleading into that payphone receiver, the distant laughter of other drivers sharing stories in truck stop diners where I'd sat alone with my coffee, and regrets. The fog wasn't just showing me these memories. It was making me live them again with all the original emotions intact. The loneliness and determination and stubborn pride that had shaped every decision I'd made on this endless ribbon of asphalt. I tried to drive through it, to push past these ghostly recreations of my past, but the fog seemed to anticipate my movements, always staying just ahead of my headlights no matter how I adjusted my speed or direction. The visions became more frequent now, flashing past like mile markers of memory, showing me faces of people I'd met and left behind. Conversations in diners where I'd shared pieces of my soul with strangers I'd never see again. Moments of beauty witnessed from my driver's seat that no camera could have captured. There was the sunrise over the Rockies that had brought tears to my eyes. The family of deer that had crossed the highway in perfect silhouette against a full moon. The northern lights I'd seen dancing above the Alaska highway during one memorable winter run. But the fog wasn't content to show me only the beautiful or bittersweet memories. And as I continued deeper into its embrace, the visions began to take on a darker tone, revealing moments I'd spent years trying to forget. I saw myself at truck stops drinking too much coffee spiked with whiskey, trying to numb the growing realization that I'd traded a normal life for something that might not have been worth the price. There were the phone calls home that became less frequent as the years passed. The promises to visit family that I'd broken more often than kept. The gradual transformation from an adventurous young driver into a man who used the road as an escape from the very connections that might have made him whole. The most disturbing vision appeared as I crested a hill that shouldn't have existed. On this familiar route, the fog parting to reveal a scene from just 3 weeks ago, when I'd sat in my truck outside my father's funeral, unable to bring myself to go inside because I'd been on the road for his last months and hadn't even known he was sick. I watched my past self sit there in the parking lot, engine idling, wrestling with guilt and grief while the service proceeded without the son who had chosen 18 wheels over family obligations, time and time again. As if responding to the weight of this particular memory, the fog began to press closer to my truck, flowing through the ventilation system despite my efforts to seal the cab against its intrusion. The mist carried with it the scent of all the places I'd been. Truck stop coffee and diesel fumes, rain on hot asphalt and the dusty smell of grain elevators, the salt air of coastal routes and the pine-sharp clarity of mountain passes. But beneath these familiar aromas lurked something else, something that smelled like regret and lost opportunities, like the ghost of roads not taken, and chances that had slipped away while I was focused on the horizon ahead. The fog was inside my cab now, swirling around my feet and rising slowly toward the ceiling, and I realized with growing alarm that it wasn't just showing me memories anymore. It was trying to keep them, to trap me in this space between past and present where I could relive every mile I'd driven and every choice I'd made. The engine of my Peterbilt began to sputter, not from any mechanical failure, but as if the very air it needed to run was being transformed into something else, something that belonged more to memory than to the present moment. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the truck respond sluggishly, as if the fog was creating resistance against my forward motion, trying to hold me in place within its supernatural embrace. The visions were coming faster now, overlapping and blending into a kaleidoscope of highway experiences, beautiful and terrible and achingly real. All the moments that had made me who I was playing simultaneously like competing radio stations bleeding through the static. I could see every sunrise and sunset witnessed through my windshield. Every conversation shared with fellow drivers, Every mile of loneliness and freedom and desperate searching that had defined my existence on America's highways. Fighting against the fog's insistent pull, I managed to find a gap in its swirling structure. A narrow corridor that seemed to lead back toward the present moment and the familiar reality of the Tennessee mountains. My truck lurched forward as if breaking through some invisible barrier, the engine roaring back to full power as clean air rushed into the intake system, clearing away the supernatural mist that had begun to fill my lungs with the weight of accumulated memory. As I emerged from the fog bank, I found myself on the exact stretch of highway where I'd started, as if I'd been driving in some impossible circle through space and time. But my fuel gauge showed that hours had passed and hundreds of miles had somehow been consumed in what felt like mere minutes. The clear night sky stretched above me once again, stars visible and reassuring in their ancient patterns, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the fog was still there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, waiting for the next driver who needed to confront the accumulated weight of their choices on the road. I never reported what happened that night, knowing it would sound like the ravings of an exhausted driver who'd been on the highway too long. But I've never forgotten the lessons hidden in that supernatural mist. The reminder that every mile we drive leaves its mark not just on our logbooks but on our souls. And sometimes the road demands that we stop running long enough to acknowledge the price we've paid. The Crimson Dashboard. From Marcus Holloway, the dashboard of my Peterbilt had been bleeding for 3 days straight when I finally decided to pull into that rest stop outside Bakersfield. Not the kind of bleeding you might expect from some busted hydraulic line or cherry soda spilled during a rough turn, but actual blood that seemed to seep from the plastic itself, thick and dark as motor oil, but with that unmistakable copper scent that made my stomach turn every time the air conditioning kicked on. I'd been running freight between Phoenix and Sacramento for the better part of 15 years, and my rig had seen its share of strange things. Desert mirages that looked like lakes, shadows that moved wrong in the side mirrors, radio stations that came through clear as day playing music from decades I couldn't place. But this was different. This was inside my cab, inside the space that had become more home to me than any apartment I'd ever rented. And it was getting worse with each passing hour. The bleeding had started small, just a few drops near the speedometer that I'd initially mistaken for coffee stains in the pre-dawn darkness of my Tuesday morning departure. But as the sun climbed higher and the Nevada asphalt began to shimmer with heat waves, more drops appeared. They seemed to emerge from microscopic pores in the dashboard surface, beating up like morning dew before forming thin rivulets that traced the contours of my instrument panel like tiny red rivers seeking the sea. By Wednesday evening, the trickle had become a steady weep that required me to keep a roll of paper towels within arm's reach. I'd tried everything I could think of to stop it. Duct tape, which the blood somehow managed to seep through. Plastic sheeting that became slick and dangerous when the crimson fluid pooled beneath it. Even a thick towel that I'd secured with bungee cords, but the blood soaked through that too, filling my cab with a smell that reminded me of the slaughterhouse my grandfather had worked at when I was young. The worst part wasn't the mess or the smell, though both of those things were becoming unbearable. The worst part was the way the blood felt warm when I accidentally brushed against it, and how it seemed to pulse with a rhythm that almost matched my heartbeat. Almost, but not quite, like an echo that was just slightly out of sync with the original sound. I'd considered pulling over sooner, maybe finding a truck stop with a decent mechanic who might be able to explain what was happening, but something kept me driving, some combination of curiosity and dread that made me want to see how far this strange phenomenon would go. Besides, my delivery schedule was tight, and the company didn't look kindly on drivers who fell behind because of what they might consider supernatural nonsense. The rest stop was one of those forgettable concrete islands that dotted the interstate system, all harsh fluorescent lighting and cracked asphalt that had been baking under the California sun for decades. A few other trucks were scattered across the lot like sleeping giants, their diesel engines ticking as they cooled in the evening air. I pulled into a space far from the others and killed my engine, immediately noticing how the sudden silence made the sound of my own breathing seem unnaturally loud. In the quiet, I could hear something else too. A soft dripping sound that seemed to be coming from my dashboard, steady as a metronome and somehow more unsettling than the mechanical roar of the highway had been. I reached for my flashlight and directed its beam toward the instrument panel, and what I saw there made my hands shake so badly that the light danced across the cab like a drunken firefly. The bleeding had spread. What had started as a few drops near the speedometer had become a network of crimson streams that covered nearly the entire dashboard. But more disturbing than the quantity was the pattern. The blood wasn't flowing randomly down the plastic surface as gravity would dictate. Instead, it was forming shapes, symbols that looked almost like letters from some alphabet I didn't recognize, characters that seemed to shift and change whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. I sat there in my driver's seat for what felt like hours, watching the blood continue to seep and flow, occasionally reaching out with a paper towel to wipe away a section, only to see it immediately begin bleeding again. The warmth of it was even more noticeable now, as if the dashboard had developed a fever that was slowly spreading throughout my cab. When I placed my palm flat against the plastic, I could swear I felt something moving beneath the surface, something that pulsed and writhed like a living thing trying to break free. That's when I noticed the radio was on, though I was certain I hadn't turned it on after parking. Static filled the cab, but beneath the white noise, I could make out what sounded like whispers. Voices speaking in languages I couldn't understand, but that filled me with an inexplicable sense of longing and loss. The voices seemed to be coming from inside the dashboard itself, as if the bleeding plastic had somehow become a conduit for communications from somewhere else entirely. I reached for the radio's power knob, desperate to silence the whispers that were growing louder and more insistent. But the moment my fingers made contact with the blood-slicked control, the voices stopped. In the sudden quiet, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling my truck, accompanied by what sounded like fingernails or claws scraping against the metal of my trailer. Through my side window, I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows between the overhead lights, shapes that might have been human but moved wrong, as if their joints bent in directions that anatomy shouldn't allow. They seemed to be drawn to my truck specifically, ignoring the other vehicles in the lot as they continued their slow circuit around my rig. The dashboard bleeding intensified, the trickle becoming a steady flow that began to pool on the floor of my cab. But the strangest thing was that despite the increasing volume of blood, it never seemed to actually accumulate. Instead, it appeared to be absorbed by the carpet and upholstery, leaving behind dark stains that pulsed with their own faint luminescence in the dim light. One of the shapes outside moved closer to my window, and in the brief moment that it passed through a cone of fluorescent light, I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was human in the loosest sense of the word, but its skin had the same plastic sheen as my dashboard, and from dozens of tiny pores across its surface, blood was seeping in the same steady rhythm that I'd been watching for the past 3 days. The thing pressed its face against my window, leaving smears of crimson on the glass as it peered inside my cab, with eyes that looked like dark holes in the universe. When it smiled, I saw that its teeth were the same off-white color as my dashboard, and blood ran from its gums like saliva. Without thinking, I turned the key in the ignition, and my engine roared to life with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence. The creatures outside scattered like roaches when a light comes on, moving with that same wrong-jointed gait as they disappeared into the shadows beyond the rest stop's illumination. I threw my transmission into gear and accelerated out of the parking lot so quickly that my trailer wheels nearly lost traction on the loose gravel. But as I merged back onto the interstate, I realized that my escape might have been premature. The dashboard was no longer just bleeding. It was beginning to bulge upward in places, as if something was pushing against it from the inside. The radio had come back on by itself and the whispers had returned. But now they seemed to be speaking in unison, chanting something in a rhythm that matched the pulsing of the blood. I drove through the night with my windows down, trying to clear the copper scent from my cab, but it seemed to have soaked into every surface. Every few miles I would catch glimpses in my mirrors of those plastic-skinned figures standing on overpasses or walking along the shoulder, always facing my direction as I passed, always bleeding from those tiny pores in their artificial flesh. Dawn found me in a truck stop outside Modesto, exhausted and shaking as I filled my fuel tanks. The dashboard had finally stopped bleeding, but the stains remained, and when I ran my fingers across the plastic surface, I could feel raised areas that felt disturbingly like scars. The radio had gone silent too, but I didn't dare turn it on to see if it still worked. I completed my delivery that afternoon and immediately put in for a week of personal time, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely untrue. My truck is parked outside my apartment now, and I haven't had the courage to climb back into the cab since I returned home. But every night I hear that soft dripping sound coming from the parking lot, steady as rainfall on a tin roof. And sometimes I see dark stains spreading across the concrete beneath my trailer, the infinite mile. From Jake Henley, the CB radio crackled to life as I descended into the Mojave Valley, its static-filled voice cutting through the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine. Eastbound traffic, this is Big Dog leading a convoy of 6 through the night run to Barstow. Anyone wanting to join up for some company? We're mile marker 247 and rolling steady. I glanced at the green glow of my dashboard clock, the numbers reading 2:17 a.m. in that peculiar desert darkness, where the world feels suspended between today and tomorrow. The voice sounded friendly enough, and after 12 hours of solo driving with nothing but sagebrush and empty highway for company, the idea of traveling with others seemed welcome. I reached for the handset, my fingers finding the familiar worn plastic in the dim cab lighting. Big Dog, this is Desert Runner in a Blue Pete heading eastbound. I'm about 3 miles back from your position, and wouldn't mind some company through the night. Mind if I catch up? Come on up, Desert Runner. We got room for one more. Look for the lead truck with the chrome stacks and LED running lights. We'll keep the hammer down easy so you can join the party. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the diesel engine respond with that deep, satisfying rumble that had been my companion across thousands of miles of American highway. The speedometer climbed as I began closing the distance, my headlights cutting through the cool desert air. The Mojave at night has its own particular beauty, with Joshua trees standing like ancient sentinels against a star-filled sky that seems to go on forever. Within 10 minutes, I spotted the convoy ahead exactly as described. 6 trucks running in perfect formation, their red taillights creating a string of rubies against the black asphalt. The lead truck was indeed impressive, a classic Kenworth with polished chrome that caught and reflected my headlights like a mirror. I eased off the throttle and fell into position behind the last truck, a yellow Freightliner carrying what looked like construction equipment under tarps. Welcome to the party, Desert Runner, came Big Dog's voice again. We got a good group here tonight. Should make the miles pass easier. The convoy settled into a comfortable rhythm, all 7 trucks now moving as one organism through the desert landscape. There was something deeply satisfying about traveling this way, the way truckers had done for decades, watching out for each other and sharing the burden of the long road. My CB occasionally picked up chatter between the other drivers, friendly banter about fuel stops and weather conditions ahead. But as we rolled deeper into the night, I began to notice something odd. The mile markers we passed seemed familiar, not just in their standard highway design, but in their specific details. A particular chunk of missing concrete at marker 251, a small desert shrub growing at an unusual angle near marker 252, a distinctive rock formation visible at marker 253. These details felt like memories, as if I had seen them before recently. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the hypnotic nature of long-distance driving. Desert highways could play tricks on a tired mind, and I had been on the road for many hours. The steady drone of engines, the rhythmic pattern of white lines passing beneath my wheels, the gentle sway of the cab over the suspension, all of it could create a trance-like state where reality became fluid. The convoy maintained its steady pace, and I found myself relaxing into the familiar routine of nighttime trucking. But then I noticed something that made me sit up straighter in my seat. We were passing mile marker 247 again, the same marker where I had first made contact with Big Dog's convoy. I was certain of it because of a specific graffiti tag on the sign, a small lightning bolt spray-painted in faded blue. I keyed the radio. "Big Dog, this is Desert Runner. Are we running a loop here? I could swear we just passed marker 247 again." Static filled the channel for several long seconds before Big Dog's voice returned, but there was something different about it now. A subtle change in tone that I couldn't quite identify. "Negative, Desert Runner. We're making good time eastbound. Must be your eyes playing tricks in the dark." But I knew what I had seen. The distinctive lightning bolt graffiti had been unmistakable, and now a growing sense of unease began to settle in my chest like cold water. I checked my GPS unit, but the screen showed only a blank grid with no roads or landmarks marked. The device seemed to be searching for satellites it couldn't find, its usual reliable guidance replaced by an endless seeking pattern. I tried to focus on the road ahead, watching the taillights of the yellow Freightliner in front of me, but my attention kept drifting to the mile markers. Each one we passed carried that same feeling of déjà vu, that same nagging sense that I had witnessed these exact details before. A coyote standing motionless beside marker 248, a damaged guardrail section at marker 249, a cluster of pale desert flowers near marker 250. The CB crackled with conversation between the other drivers, but now I listened more carefully to their voices. They discussed route conditions and fuel economy, shared stories about deliveries and destinations, but something about their words felt rehearsed, like actors performing a familiar script. The timing of their conversations, the specific phrases they used, even their laughter seemed to follow a predetermined pattern. When we reached mile marker 253, I was ready for it. The distinctive rock formation came into view exactly as I expected, and I realized with growing alarm that we were indeed traveling the same stretch of highway repeatedly. But how was that possible? We had been moving steadily eastbound for hours, never turning, never changing direction. I tried the CB again. "This is Desert Runner calling any station. Can anyone confirm our current location? I'm showing some confusion on my navigation equipment." The response came not from Big Dog, but from one of the other drivers in the convoy, a woman's voice I hadn't heard before. "Desert Runner, this is Night Owl in the Red Mac. You sound worried, honey. Everything all right back there?" "I think we might be going in circles," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The mile markers seemed to be repeating. "Oh, that happens sometimes out here in the desert," Night Owl replied with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "The road can play tricks on you when you're tired. Just stay with the convoy and we'll get you through safe and sound." But I wasn't tired, not anymore. The adrenaline of realization had burned away any fatigue, leaving me hyper-aware of every detail around me, the way the other trucks maintained their exact spacing, never wavering by so much as a foot. The way the stars overhead seemed fixed in position, not shifting as they should during hours of eastward travel. The way my fuel gauge remained at exactly 3/4 full despite hours of driving. I began to count the mile markers as we passed them, confirming my growing certainty. 247, 248, 249, 250, 251, 252, 253, and then somehow impossibly 247 again. The same 6-mile stretch of highway, repeating endlessly like a loop of film running through an old projector. The convoy continued its steady pace, and I realized that the other drivers either didn't notice the repetition or didn't care. Their CB chatter continued in the same friendly patterns, discussing the same topics in the same words. Big Dog commented on the clear weather. Night Owl mentioned a good truck stop ahead, and others chimed in with observations that I now recognized as identical to conversations from previous loops. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I considered my options. I could continue following the convoy, trapped in this endless repetition of highway miles, or I could try to break free. But break free to where? The desert stretched away into darkness on both sides, and I had no idea what lay beyond the narrow corridor of repeated asphalt. I decided to test the boundaries of this strange situation. As we approached mile marker 251, where the highway curved gently to the left, I eased my truck toward the right shoulder, planning to slow down and let the convoy continue without me. But as my wheels touched the white line at the road's edge, something invisible seemed to push back, a gentle but unmistakable force that guided my truck back into the proper lane. The CB erupted with concerned voices. "Desert Runner, you're drifting there, buddy," came Big Dog's voice. "Stay with us now. The road can be dangerous for a truck traveling alone." I tried again at mile marker 252, this time attempting to change lanes to pass the yellow Freightliner ahead of me. But again, that same invisible resistance prevented my movement, keeping me locked in position within the convoy's formation. It was as if we were all connected by invisible threads, unable to deviate from our predetermined path through the repeating miles. The trailer that tells stories. From Marcus the Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I pulled into the truck stop outside Bakersfield, the amber glow of sodium lights cutting through the desert darkness. After 18 years of hauling freight across the American highways, I thought I'd seen everything the road had to offer. Empty trailers, overloaded ones, cargo that shifted and groaned with every turn. But I'd never encountered a trailer that wanted to talk. It started 3 nights ago when I picked up the rig from a freight yard in Phoenix. The dispatcher, a nervous man with sweat stains darkening his shirt despite the evening cool, handed me the keys with trembling fingers. He mentioned something about the previous driver quitting suddenly, leaving the trailer sitting in the yard for 2 weeks. Standard 32-footer. Nothing special about it except for the way it seemed to absorb the fluorescent light from the yard lamps, making it appear darker than the surrounding shadows. The paperwork listed the trailer as empty, deadheading back to a depot in Sacramento. Easy money for a seasoned driver like me. I performed my pre-trip inspection by flashlight, checking the tires, brakes, and coupling. Everything seemed normal except for a faint scratching sound that seemed to come from within the trailer walls themselves. I attributed it to settling metal, the way aluminum expands and contracts with temperature changes. The desert does strange things to equipment. The first message appeared somewhere between Flagstaff and Needles, written in the dust that coated my rear trailer doors. I noticed it during a fuel stop, the letters crude but unmistakable in the beam of my flashlight. "Help me," spelled out in finger-wide strokes through the grime. My first thought was some kid's prank, maybe written at the previous stop while I was inside paying for fuel. Truckers, lot attendants, locals, even other drivers sometimes played jokes on long haulers. I wiped it clean with a rag and thought nothing more of it. But the second message made me pause. "I'm still here" appeared on my mud flaps the next morning after a rest stop in Barstow. This time I was certain no one had been near my rig. I'd parked away from the other trucks, taken a 20-minute nap in the sleeper berth, and kept one ear open for footsteps on the gravel. The truck stop security cameras would have caught anyone approaching my trailer, yet there were the letters, clear as daylight in the dust and road grime. The scratching sounds grew more pronounced as I drove through the Mojave, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to follow the rhythm of my turn signals. At first I convinced myself it was cargo shifting, though the manifest clearly stated the trailer was empty. Perhaps the previous driver had left something behind. some forgotten piece of equipment sliding back and forth with the motion of the road. But empty trailers have a particular sound when they roll, a hollow echo that I knew well. And this trailer sounded different, fuller, as if something substantial moved within its aluminum walls. By the third morning, the messages had grown longer and more desperate. "Don't leave me alone," stretched across the entire length of the trailer's side, written at a height that would require someone standing on the running boards while the truck was moving. The letters were precise, carefully formed, not the hasty scrawl of a vandal or prankster. Whoever was writing these messages was taking their time, treating each word with deliberate care. I started checking the trailer more frequently, stopping at rest areas and truck stops to examine every inch of the exterior. The scratching sounds had evolved into something more complex, almost like Morse code or the tapping of fingernails against metal. During daylight hours, the sounds were barely audible over the road noise and engine rumble, but in the quiet moments when I downshifted for mountain passes or idled at traffic lights, they became impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came on a foggy evening as I descended through the grapevine toward the Central Valley. The marine layer had rolled inland, reducing visibility to mere yards and forcing me to crawl along at 30 miles per hour. In the eerie quiet of the fog-muffled highway, I could hear the scratching with perfect clarity. It wasn't random or mechanical. Someone or something was methodically working from inside the trailer. I pulled into the first available truck stop, a small independent operation with flickering neon signs and cracked asphalt. The fog had followed me inland, wrapping the facility in a gray shroud that muffled sound and limited vision. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the rear of the trailer, my boots crunching on scattered gravel. The scratching had stopped the moment I shut down the engine, but a new message waited for me on the back doors. "Please don't open this," covered both doors in careful block letters. Below it, in smaller script, were the words, "They think I'm dead." My hands shook as I played the flashlight beam across the message. The letters appeared fresh, the metal beneath them still bright where fingers had traced through the accumulated dust and grime. For the first time in 18 years of trucking, I seriously considered abandoning a load. The rational part of my mind insisted that someone was playing an elaborate joke, though I couldn't fathom how they were accessing the trailer without my knowledge. But the growing dread in my stomach suggested something far more unsettling was occurring. The trailer felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, as if it carried more than empty air within its walls. I circled the trailer with my flashlight, checking the locking mechanism on the rear doors. The seal was intact, exactly as it had been when I picked up the load in Phoenix. No signs of forced entry or tampering. The side doors were similarly secured, their locks showing no evidence of manipulation. Yet the scratching resumed the moment I climbed back into the cab. More insistent now, almost frantic. The fog began to thin as I approached Bakersfield, revealing a landscape of oil derricks and agricultural fields under a pre-dawn sky. The scratching had evolved into something that sounded disturbingly like knocking, as if someone were rapping their knuckles against the trailer walls from the inside. 3 quick taps, followed by 2 longer ones, repeated endlessly in a pattern that suggested intelligence and intent. I found myself talking to whatever was in the trailer, my voice barely audible over the engine noise. "I hear you," I said, feeling foolish but desperate for some kind of communication. "I don't know what you want me to do." The knocking stopped immediately, replaced by a rapid scratching that sounded urgent, almost excited. At the next truck stop, a well-lit facility with modern amenities and good security, I discovered the longest message yet. It covered the entire passenger side of the trailer, written in the same careful script. "They put me in here 5 years ago. I was supposed to be, the driver was supposed, to open the doors in Sacramento. But he got scared and left the trailer in Phoenix. I've been waiting." My blood ran cold as I read the words. 5 years was a long time for a trailer to sit abandoned, though it wasn't unheard of in the freight industry. Trailers sometimes became lost in the shuffle of corporate mergers, paperwork errors, or legal disputes. But 5 years was also long enough for someone to die of thirst, starvation, or suffocation if they'd been accidentally locked inside. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the dispatcher who'd given me the load, but the call went straight to voicemail. The freight company's main office wouldn't open for another 3 hours, leaving me alone with my growing certainty that I was hauling something far more serious than empty air. The ethical choice was clear. I needed to open the trailer and see what was inside. But the messages themselves warned against that very action, creating a paralysis of indecision. The knocking resumed, more urgent than before, as if whatever was inside sensed my internal struggle. I walked to the rear doors and pressed my ear against the cold metal. The knocking was definitely coming from within, accompanied by what sounded like whispered words too faint to understand. My hand moved to the lock mechanism before I caught myself. What if opening the doors was exactly the wrong thing to do? What if the messages were meant to lure me into some kind of trap? Dawn was breaking as I made my decision. I couldn't continue hauling the trailer without knowing what was inside, regardless of the potential consequences. I had a moral obligation to investigate, especially if someone had been trapped inside for years. I cut the security seal with my knife and reached for the door handles, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. That's when I heard the sirens approaching from the distance, growing louder by the second. 3 police cruisers pulled into the truck stop, their emergency lights painting the morning fog in alternating red and blue. They surrounded my rig before I could open the doors, officers emerging with hands on their weapons. The questions we answer in the dark. From Marcus Chen. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the October moon, my 18-wheeler's headlights cutting through the darkness as I made my way toward the Ohio border. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to auto parts, and I knew every truck stop, every way station, every shortcut between here and Cleveland. The familiar hum of my Peterbilt's engine was a comfort, a steady rhythm that had lulled me through countless nights on the road. Rain began to speckle my windshield, gentle at first, then building to a steady drumming that mixed with the rumble of tires on asphalt. I was running behind schedule, which wasn't unusual, but tonight felt different somehow. The radio had been crackling with strange interference for the past hour, stations fading in and out like whispers from another world. Static would suddenly give way to old songs from decades past, then dissolve back into white noise. I'd given up trying to find a clear channel and was driving in the relative quiet of engine noise and rain when I saw the glow ahead. At first, I thought it might be construction lights or maybe an accident scene, but as I crested a small hill, I could see it was a toll booth. This struck me as odd because I'd driven this stretch of highway hundreds of times, and there had never been a toll plaza here. The interstate had been free through this section for as long as I could remember. But there it was, a concrete island rising from the asphalt with a single booth bathed in sickly yellow light. A sign overhead read, "Checkpoint ahead, mandatory stop," in letters that seemed to flicker like dying neon. I downshifted, the engine brake engaging with its characteristic whoosh of compressed air, and guided my rig toward the single open lane. There were no other vehicles in sight, which seemed strange for a main trucking corridor even at 2 in the morning. The booth itself looked freshly constructed, its white concrete walls unmarred by weather or age. Yet something about it felt ancient, as if it had been waiting here much longer than its appearance suggested. As I rolled to a stop, my air brakes hissing, I could see the attendant through the booth's window. He was a thin man in a crisp uniform, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. When he leaned out to speak to me, I noticed his eyes were an unusual shade of gray, almost colorless, and they seemed to look right through me rather than at me. "Good evening," he said in a voice that was professionally pleasant yet somehow hollow. "Welcome to the confession toll. Before you can proceed, I'll need to collect payment in the form of information about your past." I laughed. thinking this was some kind of joke or maybe a new security measure I hadn't heard about. Information about my past? Look, buddy, I just need to get through. I've got a delivery to make in Cleveland by morning. The attendant's smile never wavered, but something in his colorless eyes shifted. I'm afraid it's mandatory, sir. Everyone pays the same way here. We need to know about something you've done that you're not proud of. Something you've never told anyone. The road ahead requires honesty. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October night. I glanced in my mirrors, thinking maybe I should just back up and find another route. But when I looked behind me, the road I'd just traveled was gone. In its place stretched an empty field covered in morning mist, as if the highway had never existed at all. That's impossible, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Time works differently here, the attendant said, as if he'd heard my thoughts. The road behind disappears for everyone. The only way forward is through honesty. Tell me something true about your past, something that weighs on you and you can continue on your way. My mouth went dry. I thought about my life, about the choices I'd made over 43 years. Everyone has regrets, secrets they keep buried, but speaking them aloud to a stranger in the middle of the night felt wrong, dangerous somehow. Yet as I sat there, the engine idling, I could feel a strange compulsion building inside me, as if the booth itself was drawing the words from my chest. I don't understand what kind of toll this is, I managed to say. The most important kind, the attendant replied. The kind that asks what you're carrying besides cargo. Tell me about a moment when you chose silence instead of speaking up. Tell me about someone you failed when they needed you most. The words hit me like a physical blow because I knew exactly what he was talking about. My hands began to tremble on the steering wheel as memories I'd spent years trying to suppress came flooding back. The attendant watched patiently, his gray eyes reflecting the booth's harsh light like mirrors. There was a kid at my high school. I found myself saying, the words coming out before I could stop them. Jimmy Brennan. He was different, you know. Quiet, kept to himself. Some of the other guys used to pick on him pretty bad. My voice cracked as the memory became clearer, more painful. One day they cornered him in the locker room. I was there changing after practice. They were really hurting him, not just teasing, and I could have stopped it. I was bigger than them. I was on the football team. They would have listened to me. But you didn't, the attendant said softly. No, I whispered. I finished getting dressed and I walked away. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I didn't want to get involved. But the truth was I was scared. Scared they'd turn on me next. Scared I'd lose my place on the team. Scared I'd become an outcast like Jimmy. Tears were running down my face now. 25 years of guilt pouring out in the cab of my truck. He killed himself 3 weeks later. Left a note talking about how alone he felt. How no one cared enough to help him. I could have been that person. I could have saved his life with just a few words, and I chose not to. The attendant nodded slowly, and for a moment, his expression seemed almost compassionate. Thank you for your honesty, Marcus. That's exactly the kind of truth this road requires. He stepped back into the booth, and I heard the mechanical whir of the gate beginning to rise. But as it did, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. The booth's window was now dark, empty, as if no one had ever been inside. I could see clear through to the other side, and the uniform the attendant had been wearing was draped over an empty chair like shed skin. Wait! I called out, but there was no response. The gate continued its slow ascent, revealing the highway stretching ahead into darkness. Behind me I could hear sounds like whispers, like voices discussing what I'd just confessed. But when I looked in my mirrors, I saw only that impossible misty field. I pressed the accelerator and my truck lurched forward through the toll plaza. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the booth and its sickly light vanished from my mirrors as if it had never existed. The highway behind me was normal again, complete with lane markers and guardrails, but I could still hear those whispers in the wind. And I had the unsettling feeling that my confession had been heard by more than just the gray-eyed attendant. Miles passed in a blur of rain and reflected headlights. I tried to convince myself it had been some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue and too much coffee, but the memory was too vivid, too real. And deep in my chest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 25 years. A strange kind of relief, as if a weight I'd carried for so long had finally been acknowledged, even if I didn't understand by whom or why. When I finally reached Cleveland and made my delivery, everything proceeded normally. The loading dock workers were their usual efficient selves, the paperwork processed without incident. But as I prepared for the return trip, I found myself taking a different route, one that avoided that stretch of interstate entirely. Some roads, I realized, change you in ways you can never predict, and some tolls can never truly be paid in full. Even now, months later, I sometimes wonder if that booth is still out there somewhere, waiting for the next traveler with secrets to confess. And I find myself hoping that whoever encounters it next will have the courage to speak their truth. Because I learned that night that some burdens grow heavier in silence, and sometimes the strangest mercy comes from the most unexpected places. The cargo that reached back. From Jake Morrison, the manifest said livestock feed 40,000 pounds of it, bound for a ranch outside Billings. Nothing unusual about that kind of haul, especially not for someone who'd been running freight across Montana's endless highways for the better part of 20 years. My Peterbilt 389 hummed steady and true as I pulled out of the depot in Great Falls, the familiar weight settling behind me with that satisfying thunk of a proper hookup. The evening air carried the scent of grain elevators and diesel exhaust, and I rolled down my window to let the cool September breeze wash over my face as I merged onto Highway 87. The sun hung low and orange on the horizon, casting long shadows across the rolling plains that stretched endlessly in every direction. This was my favorite time to drive, when the world seemed to hold its breath between day and night, when the radio played soft country ballads and the road belonged to us night haulers. I'd made this run dozens of times before, knew every truck stop and way station between here and Billings, could probably drive it with my eyes closed if I had to. The load felt good behind me, distributed evenly across the trailer's length, though there was something about the way it shifted when I took the on-ramp that made me glance back at my mirrors. The first hour passed without incident, mile markers clicking by in steady rhythm as the daylight faded to purple twilight. I kept my speed steady at 65. No sense pushing it with a heavy load and plenty of time to make delivery. The CB radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching ahead. That's when I first noticed the sound, a soft scratching that seemed to come from somewhere behind my sleeper cab. At first I figured it was just the tarp shifting in the wind, or maybe some loose strapping rubbing against the trailer walls. These old rigs make all kinds of noises when they're loaded down heavy, and after 2 decades behind the wheel, you learn to distinguish between the sounds that matter and the ones that don't. But this scratching was different somehow, more deliberate than random wind noise. It came in patterns, like something was trying to work its way through the trailer walls from the inside. I turned down the radio and listened more carefully, catching glimpses of the sound between the rumble of the engine and the whistle of air through the cab. Scratch, 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 pause. Scratch, 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 pause. Almost like fingers drumming against metal, though I knew that was impossible. Livestock feed doesn't have fingers, doesn't move around on its own once it's loaded and secured. The road began to climb into the foothills, and I downshifted to maintain speed as the Peterbilt's engine worked harder against the grade. Outside my windows, the landscape grew more rugged, dotted with stands of pine and aspen that looked black against the darkening sky. A light rain began to fall, just enough to streak the windshield and make the road surface gleam in my headlights. I flicked on the wipers and settled back in my seat, trying to focus on the hypnotic rhythm of rubber against glass, but that scratching sound kept pulling at my attention. By the time I crested the first major hill, the scratching had grown louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from multiple points along the trailer now, as if whatever was making the noise had spread out or multiplied. I pulled into a scenic overlook and set the air brakes. The sudden silence after shutting down the engine almost startling in its completeness. Rain pattered gently on the cab roof as I climbed down and walked back to inspect the trailer. Flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate the familiar sight of a standard dry van. Nothing out of the ordinary about its appearance. The trailer doors were still locked tight, seals intact, no signs of damage or tampering. I walked around the entire perimeter, checking the tires and running my light along the aluminum sides. But everything looked exactly as it should. The scratching had stopped the moment I shut down the engine, leaving only the soft whisper of rain and the tick of cooling metal. I stood there for several minutes, listening to the night sounds of the Montana wilderness, convincing myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Old trucks make strange noises, especially when they're carrying heavy loads over changing terrain. There was no logical reason to think anything was wrong. But as I climbed back into the cab and fired up the engine, the scratching resumed almost immediately. This time I could swear it was coming from directly behind my sleeper, as if something was working at the forward wall of the trailer. The sound was more urgent now, more focused, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter as I pulled back onto the highway. Miles rolled by in growing unease, the scratching ebbing and flowing but never completely stopping. Sometimes it seemed to move from one side of the trailer to the other. Sometimes it intensified when I hit bumps or took curves, and sometimes it fell silent for long stretches only to return when I least expected it. The rain grew heavier as I descended toward the Yellowstone River Valley, turning from gentle pattering to steady drumming on the cab roof. My headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead in harsh white detail while everything beyond remained black and unknowable. The scratching had evolved into something else now, something that sounded less like claws on metal and more like fingers tapping in complex rhythms. Not random scratching anymore, but deliberate patterns that almost seemed like communication. I tried turning up the radio to drown out the sound, but even with the volume cranked high, I could still hear it underneath the music. It had become part of the truck now, as constant and unavoidable as the engine noise or the whistle of wind through the mirrors. When I reached for the CB to talk to other drivers, hoping for some human contact to break the growing tension, the scratching seemed to respond to my movement, growing more intense whenever I tried to communicate with the outside world. That's when I first saw them in the mirror, pale shapes pressed against the small window in the forward wall of the trailer. At highway speed and in the darkness, it was impossible to make out details. But there was definitely something moving back there. Something that shouldn't exist in a load of livestock feed. I told myself it had to be shifting cargo, bags of grain that had come loose and were now tumbling around in the trailer. But bags of grain don't press against windows, don't seem to watch the road ahead with what looked disturbingly like intent. As I navigated a series of sweeping curves that followed the river, the shapes in the mirror became more distinct. They looked like hands, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all pressed against the glass like children trying to see out of a school bus window. But these weren't children's hands. They were too pale, too long, with fingers that seemed to move independently of any connecting arms. Some tapped against the glass in those same rhythmic patterns I'd been hearing, while others simply pressed flat against the surface as if testing its strength. The rational part of my mind kept insisting this had to be some kind of hallucination brought on by long hours and highway hypnosis, but the sight was so clear, so undeniably real in my mirror, that rational thought began to crumble. The hands were definitely there, definitely moving and definitely trying to get my attention. Some of them had begun to gesture, pointing forward at the road ahead as if they were passengers eager to reach their destination. Others seemed to be beckoning to me, pale fingers curling and uncurling in invitation. I tried to focus on the road, on the familiar routine of steering and shifting and watching for other traffic. But my eyes kept drifting back to that mirror. The hands had multiplied again, covering every inch of the small window now, overlapping and interweaving like some impossible organic tapestry. When I hit a particularly sharp curve, they all pressed harder against the glass, and I could swear I heard a sound like a collective sigh echo through the trailer walls. The rain had turned the highway treacherous, and I had to slow down as my tires fought for grip on the slick asphalt. Behind me, the hands seemed to react to every change in speed or direction, moving in waves that followed the truck's motion. When I accelerated, they spread their fingers wide as if feeling the rush of forward movement. When I braked, they bunched together as if bracing for impact. It was as if the cargo behind me was not only alive but aware, somehow connected to the truck's systems in ways that defied every law of physics I thought I understood. A truck stop appeared ahead, its neon signs reflected in puddles of standing water, and I made the decision to pull in. Whatever was happening back there, I needed to get the trailer doors open and see for myself what I was really hauling. The Peterbilt rolled to a stop in the back corner of the lot, away from the other trucks and the harsh fluorescent lights of the main building. I set the brakes and reached for my door handle, but the moment the engine shut down, the rhythm of the road. From Jake Henderson, the CB radio had been clicking in perfect rhythm for the past 200 miles, a steady tick-tick pause tick that matched the hypnotic beat of my windshield wipers as they swept away the Montana drizzle. I'd been hauling freight across these endless highways for 15 years, and in all that time I'd never heard anything quite like it. The sound wasn't coming through the speaker exactly, but from somewhere deep inside the radio itself, like a mechanical heartbeat that had synchronized with the pulse of my 18-wheeler as we rolled through the pre-dawn darkness. My rig, a 2018 Peterbilt with over 500,000 miles on her odometer, hummed steadily beneath me as I navigated the winding two-lane that cut through the Bitterroot Mountains. The load I was carrying, industrial machinery bound for Spokane, shifted slightly with each curve, and I found myself timing my turns to match that persistent clicking. Tick, tick, pause, tick. It was oddly soothing, like a metronome keeping time with the symphony of diesel engine and road noise that had become the soundtrack to my life. I'd picked up the CB radio at a truck stop outside Billings 3 days earlier. My old Cobra had finally given up the ghost after years of faithful service, its circuits fried by a lightning strike during a violent thunderstorm in Nebraska. The replacement was an older model, a vintage Midland that the guy behind the counter swore had belonged to a driver named Curtis Whitman. The name meant nothing to me then, but the price was right, and I needed communication for the long haul ahead. The clicking had started somewhere around Missoula, just as I'd turned onto Highway 93 and begun the climb into the mountains. At first I thought it might be interference from the radio towers scattered across the peaks, or maybe a loose connection in the wiring. But the sound was too regular, too purposeful to be random electronic noise. It had a quality that reminded me of Morse code, though I couldn't make sense of any pattern beyond the relentless 4-beat rhythm that had now been my companion for hours. The fog was getting thicker as I climbed higher into the mountains, and my headlights carved pale tunnels through the murky air. The CB's green display cast an eerie glow across my dashboard, and I noticed that the clicking seemed to intensify whenever I tried to change channels. I'd attempted to raise other drivers several times, hoping someone might explain what I was hearing, but every frequency carried the same rhythmic pulse. Even the emergency channel, usually clear as crystal, was dominated by that hypnotic tick-tick pause tick. As I rounded a sharp curve, my headlights swept across a historical marker barely visible through the fog. I caught only a glimpse, but the words Curtis Whitman Memorial seemed to leap out at me from the weathered bronze plaque. The clicking from my CB radio suddenly grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through my cab's weather stripping. I eased off the accelerator, letting my rig coast while I tried to process what I'd just seen. The memorial marker disappeared into the fog behind me, but the clicking continued, now accompanied by a faint static that seemed to carry whispers just below the threshold of understanding. I reached for the CB's volume control, but my hand hesitated as I realized the whispers were keeping time with the clicks. Tick, tick, pause, tick, and in that pause, something that might have been words in a voice that sounded like it was coming from a great distance. I'd heard stories, of course. Every long-haul driver had. Tales of phantom truckers who still traveled routes they'd driven in life, their presence marked by strange radio signals and unexplained CB chatter. But I'd always dismissed such stories as the products of too much coffee, too little sleep, and too many lonely miles on empty highways. Now, listening to that relentless rhythm, I found myself reconsidering everything I thought I knew about the roads I traveled. The fog began to thin as I crested a ridge, and the lights of a truck stop appeared in the distance like a beacon of normalcy in the supernatural gloom. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, and my logbook demanded a mandatory rest period, but something about that clicking made me reluctant to stop. It had become part of the rhythm of my journey, and I feared that silence might be worse than the mystery of its source. As I pulled into the truck stop's parking area, my CB radio suddenly crackled to life with a burst of clear transmission. "Eastbound Peterbilt, this is Phantom Rider. You've been carrying my voice for 200 miles now." The clicking stopped abruptly, replaced by static that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. "That radio you're using belonged to me once. I've been trying to tell you something important, but the signal's been weak up in these mountains." I grabbed the microphone with trembling fingers, my voice barely steady as I keyed the transmit button. "This is Jake Henderson in the Peterbilt." "Curtis Whitman, is that you?" The question felt ridiculous even as I asked it, but the alternative explanation seemed even more impossible. "That's right, driver. Listen carefully because I don't have much time before the signal fades again. About 15 miles ahead, just past mile marker 47, you're going to come to a section where the guardrail's been repaired. Fresh welding, newer posts. Don't take that curve at normal speed. The road washed out in last week's storms, and they haven't properly reinforced the shoulder yet. I went over the edge there 3 days ago." The radio fell silent except for the soft hiss of static, and I sat in my idling truck trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. The rational part of my mind insisted that someone was playing an elaborate prank, but the clicking had been too consistent, too purposeful to be anything but genuine communication from someone desperately trying to send a message. I grabbed my atlas and checked the route ahead. Mile marker 47 was indeed about 15 miles up the highway, in a section known for its treacherous curves and steep drop-offs. The fog was still thick enough to obscure the road conditions, and I'd been relying entirely on my headlights and the faded yellow lines to guide me through the mountain passes. As I pulled back onto the highway, the clicking resumed, but now it seemed different somehow, more urgent and irregular. Instead of the steady 4-beat pattern that had accompanied me for hours, the rhythm was broken and frantic, like someone tapping out a warning in desperate haste. The fog seemed to press closer around my truck, and my headlights barely penetrated more than 50 feet ahead. Mile marker 45 appeared in my headlights, then 46, and I began to reduce my speed despite the urgent schedule that had been driving me hard across 3 states. The clicking from my CB radio became almost violent in its intensity, and I could hear that distant voice again, clearer now. "Slow down, driver. Almost there. You'll see the reflectors from the new guardrail posts, but don't trust the road surface." Mile marker 47 appeared through the fog like a ghost materializing from the darkness, and immediately I could see what Curtis Whitman's spirit had been trying to warn me about. The guardrail was indeed newly repaired, bright silver welding marks visible even in the dim light, but beyond it was nothing but empty air and a drop that disappeared into the foggy void. The road's shoulder had been completely undermined by erosion, leaving only a thin ribbon of asphalt suspended over a deadly precipice. I downshifted carefully, letting my engine brake handle most of the deceleration as I navigated around the damaged section at barely 15 miles per hour. My trailer's tandems tracked perfectly behind me, missing the weakened shoulder by mere inches as I guided my rig through what should have been a fatal trap for any driver traveling at normal highway speed in these conditions. As I cleared the dangerous curve and began the descent toward safer elevations, my CB radio crackled one final time. "Thank you for listening, driver." I couldn't rest knowing other truckers might follow my tracks over that edge. Maybe now I can find some peace on whatever highway comes next. The clicking faded to silence, replaced by the normal static of empty channels. I tried several times to raise Curtis Whitman again, switching through all 40 channels and calling out into the night, but received no response. The CB radio functioned perfectly for the remainder of my journey to Spokane, connecting me with other drivers, traffic reports, and weather updates without a trace of supernatural interference. But sometimes, late at night when I'm running through mountain passes in heavy fog, I still hear that rhythmic clicking in the distance, faint but unmistakable. And I always slow down, reduce my speed, and listen carefully to whatever message the phantom riders might be trying to send. Because I've learned that the highways hold more than just asphalt and painted lines. The loop that swallows miles. From Jake Morrison, the GPS died somewhere between Bakersfield and nowhere, its screen flickering to black just as the rain started drumming against my windshield like impatient fingers. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling electronics from California to Nevada, but tonight felt different somehow. The familiar weight of my 18-wheeler, a 2018 Peterbilt that had never let me down, seemed heavier than usual as I navigated through the gathering storm. Interstate 58 stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, illuminated only by the sweep of my headlights and the occasional flash of lightning that turned the desert landscape into brief, stark photographs. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, catching fragments of distant stations that faded in and out like whispered conversations. I reached for my thermos of coffee, noting how the liquid inside trembled slightly with each rumble of thunder overhead. That's when I saw the exit sign emerging from the rain-soaked darkness ahead. Exit 127, it read in those familiar green letters, though something about it seemed off. I'd driven this stretch countless times, could navigate it blindfolded, but I couldn't recall ever seeing exit 127 before. My mental map of the highway insisted there should be a 20-mile gap between exits here. Nothing but empty desert and the occasional abandoned gas station. The sensible thing would have been to keep driving, to stick to the main highway until the storm passed, but my fuel gauge was hovering near empty, and the next truck stop wasn't for another 30 miles. The exit ramp curved away into the darkness, and I could make out what looked like the glow of neon signs in the distance, promising gas and perhaps a place to wait out the worst of the weather. I eased the big rig onto the off-ramp, feeling the familiar sensation of deceleration as my engine downshifted. The rain drummed harder against the cab, and my wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. The road surface felt strange beneath my tires, too smooth for an old desert highway, and I noticed there were no reflective markers along the edges, just an endless ribbon of perfect asphalt disappearing into the night. The neon glow I'd seen from the interstate resolved into a small truck stop as I rounded a gentle curve. The sign read, Desert Rose Travel Plaza in flickering pink and blue letters, though the R in Rose kept cutting out, creating an unsettling strobe effect. The place looked like it had been frozen in time, probably built sometime in the 70s and left to weather the decades. A handful of other vehicles sat in the parking lot, their shapes indistinct through the rain-blurred windshield. I pulled into a space near the fuel pumps, noting how the diesel prices displayed on the signs were at least 50 cents cheaper than anywhere else I'd seen recently. The absence of modern credit card readers on the pump should have been my first real warning, but the promise of cheap fuel and shelter from the storm overrode my caution. I killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt profound after hours of road noise and engine rumble. The fuel attendant who emerged from the station office moved with an odd, mechanical gait, his yellow rain slicker reflecting the neon signs in shifting patterns. His face was hidden beneath the hood, but something about his posture suggested he'd been waiting for me specifically. He began fueling my truck without a word, the pump clicking and whirring with the rhythm of an old mechanical clock. While he worked, I decided to stretch my legs and grab some coffee from inside the station. The automatic doors opened with a pneumatic hiss that seemed to echo longer than it should have, and I stepped into a world that felt like stepping backward through decades. The fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical song that made my teeth ache slightly, and the air smelled of coffee that had been brewing too long, and the faint ozone scent that comes before a lightning strike. The clerk behind the counter was a thin woman with silver hair pulled back severely, her eyes the pale blue of winter sky. She smiled when I approached, but the expression didn't quite reach her eyes, and I noticed she kept glancing at the security monitor that showed the parking lot outside. On the screen I could see my truck being fueled, but there was no sign of the attendant, just the nozzle moving by itself with mechanical precision. "Coffee's fresh," she said, her voice carrying a slight echo as if we were standing in a much larger space than the cramped convenience store. Most drivers find they need something warm on a night like this. I poured myself a cup from the pot near the register, noting how the liquid seemed almost too dark, more like ink than coffee, but it was warm, and that was what mattered. As I paid for the fuel and coffee, I noticed the receipt she handed me was printed on old-fashioned paper that crinkled between my fingers, and the date stamped at the top showed a day that hadn't happened yet. When I mentioned this, she just smiled that same empty smile and said, "Time moves differently here sometimes. The storm plays tricks." Back outside, the rain had intensified to a steady downpour that turned the parking lot into a series of reflecting pools. The fuel attendant had disappeared as mysteriously as he'd appeared, leaving my truck topped off and ready for the road. I climbed back into the cab, grateful to be out of the weather, and started the engine. The familiar rumble was reassuring after the strangeness of the truck stop. Getting back onto the interstate should have been simple. I followed the signs marked Interstate 58 East, driving through the rain-soaked night with my windshield wipers beating their steady rhythm. But as I crested a small hill, I felt a disorienting sense of déjà vu. There ahead of me was the same exit sign, Exit 127, glowing in my headlights exactly as it had before. I checked my odometer, confirming I'd driven nearly 10 miles since leaving the truck stop, but somehow I was back at the same exit. This time I didn't take it, choosing instead to continue on what I assumed was the main highway. The road stretched ahead into darkness, empty except for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the desert landscape in stark black and white. 15 minutes later, the exit sign appeared again, Exit 127, exactly as before, as if I'd been driving in a perfect circle without realizing it. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I could feel a cold sweat beginning to form despite the warmth of the cab. I grabbed my CB radio and tried to raise another driver, anyone who might be able to confirm my location, but the radio produced only static and the occasional burst of what sounded like voices speaking in reverse. The third time the exit appeared, I stopped the truck right there on the highway and climbed out into the rain. The asphalt felt solid beneath my boots, and when I looked back the way I'd come, I could see my own tire tracks in the water pooling on the road surface. But when I looked ahead, the highway seemed to curve gently to the right, disappearing into darkness in a way that suggested it might eventually loop back on itself. I walked to the exit sign and examined it closely, running my hands over the reflective surface. It felt real enough, cold metal and weather-worn edges that spoke of years exposed to the elements. But when I looked closely at the mounting brackets, I noticed they cast shadows in multiple directions, as if lit by several light sources that weren't visible to me. Back in the truck, I made a decision that went against every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of long-haul driving. I took the exit again, but this time instead of stopping at the truck stop, I drove past it. The road continued beyond the neon glow, winding through low hills dotted with Joshua trees that looked like twisted figures in the lightning flashes. The pavement began to deteriorate as I drove. Smooth asphalt giving way to rough patches and eventually to what felt like gravel beneath my tires. My headlights caught glimpses of abandoned vehicles along the roadside. Other trucks and cars that had apparently taken this same route and ended up stranded. Some looked recent, their paint still glossy despite the weather, while others were rusted hulks that might have been sitting there for decades. That's when I saw the other truck in my mirrors. It appeared suddenly, as if it had materialized from the storm itself, matching my speed exactly. In my side mirror, I could make out the familiar shape of a Peterbilt cab, but the details seemed wrong somehow. The headlights were too bright, too blue, and they cast shadows that moved independently of the truck itself. I increased my speed, pushing my rig harder than I normally would on an unfamiliar road, but the other truck stayed with me, maintaining the same distance as if we were connected by an invisible chain. When I slowed down, it slowed. When I changed lanes, it mirrored my movements perfectly. The driver was just a dark silhouette behind the wheel, but I had the unsettling feeling it was watching me with the same fascination I was watching it. The Shrinking Mile, from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you start to notice when distances change, even when logic tells you they can't. I've been hauling freight between Denver and Salt Lake City since 2009, and I know every mile marker, every exit, every small town that dots Highway 40 like forgotten punctuation marks in an endless sentence. That's why when Millbrook started feeling different, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest like cold coffee on an empty stomach. It began 3 months ago on a Tuesday night run. The autumn air was crisp enough to fog my breath, and my Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I navigated the winding mountain roads. The radio crackled with static and distant voices, truckers sharing weather reports and road conditions across the vast network of asphalt that connects our scattered lives. I was making good time, the kind of smooth run that lets your mind wander to thoughts of home cooking and a warm bed waiting at the end of the line. Millbrook appeared in my headlights exactly where it always had, nestled in a valley between two pine-covered ridges like a collection of toy buildings arranged by a careful child. The town's welcome sign, painted in faded blue letters that had seen too many seasons, proclaimed a population of 2,147 residents and wished visitors a pleasant stay. I'd passed that sign thousands of times over the years, noting how the paint peeled a little more with each trip, how the bullet holes from some long-ago target practice had grown slightly larger with rust and weather. The main street stretched ahead of me, lined with the usual collection of small-town establishments: Murphy's Diner with its flickering neon coffee cup, Hendrick's Hardware Store with its weathered wooden facade, the Millbrook Motor Lodge with half its vacancy sign burned out so it read VA&Y in stuttering red letters. A few streetlights cast pools of yellow illumination on empty sidewalks, and the traffic light at the town's only intersection swayed gently in the mountain breeze, cycling through its colors for an audience of shadows in shuttered windows. What struck me as odd that first night was how quickly I passed through the town center. In my memory, Millbrook had always been a good 2-minute drive at highway speeds, maybe 3 minutes if you caught the light red. But this time, the welcome sign seemed to give way to the town limits marker with unsettling haste, as if someone had compressed the distance like an accordion folding in on itself. I glanced at my odometer, but the numbers told me nothing useful in the darkness, and I chalked it up to fatigue and the tricks that tired eyes can play on a driver's perception. 2 weeks later, the same route brought me through Millbrook again, this time on a foggy evening, when the mountain mist clung to my windshield like ghostly fingers. The town materialized out of the gray shroud with its familiar landmarks intact: Murphy's Diner, Hendrick's Hardware, the Motor Lodge with its broken sign. But as I drove through the heart of Millbrook, counting the businesses and residences that lined the main drag, I realized something was missing. The small city park that used to sit between the diner and the post office was gone. replaced by an empty lot where frost-dead grass grew in patches between bare spots of earth. I pulled over at the truck stop just outside town, a place called Roadway Rest that catered to drivers like myself, with its oversized parking spaces and 24-hour coffee. The attendant, a young woman named Sarah whom I'd chatted with dozens of times over the years, greeted me with her usual friendly smile as I entered the fluorescent-lit convenience store. "Evening. Jake," she said, not looking up from the magazine she was reading behind the counter. "How's the road treating you tonight?" "Can't complain," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the machine near the window. "Say, Sarah, what happened to that little park in town? The one with the playground and the memorial bench?" She looked up then, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Park? I'm not sure what you mean." "Millbrook doesn't have a park, never has as long as I've lived here." The coffee cup felt suddenly heavy in my hands. I'd driven past that park hundreds of times, had even stopped there once during a mandatory rest period to eat a sandwich lunch in the shade of its old oak trees. But Sarah had lived in Millbrook her entire 20-something years, and her certainty was absolute, unshakable. On my next trip through, 3 weeks later, the Hendricks hardware store was gone. In its place stood another empty lot, this one still bearing the rectangular outline where the building's foundation had been, like a pale scar on the earth. The street light that had once illuminated the store's entrance now stood in isolation, casting its yellow glow on nothing but weedy dirt and scattered leaves that rustled in the wind like whispered secrets. I stopped at Roadway Rest again, seeking answers that felt increasingly elusive. Sarah was there as always, but when I asked her about Hendricks Hardware, she gave me the same puzzled look as before. "Hardware store? The closest one I know of is over in Cedar Falls, about 30 miles east. We've never had one here in Millbrook." That night I couldn't sleep in my cab despite the exhaustion that should have pulled me into unconsciousness. Instead, I lay in my narrow bunk listening to the diesel engine tick as it cooled, thinking about disappearing buildings and altered memories, about a town that seemed to be slowly erasing itself from existence, while its residents remained blissfully unaware of the changes. Winter arrived early in the mountains that year, bringing with it snow-laden winds that howled across the highway like the voices of lost travelers. My runs through Millbrook became exercises in mounting dread, as I watched the town continue to shrink with each passage. The motor lodge vanished next, leaving behind only the electrical pole that had supported its broken sign, standing like a lonely sentinel in an empty field. Murphy's Diner followed 2 weeks later, though the neon coffee cup remained, flickering on and off above a vacant lot where snow had begun to accumulate in small drifts. By February, Millbrook had been reduced to perhaps a dozen buildings scattered along what remained of Main Street, their windows dark and their parking lots empty of everything but wind-blown snow. The welcome sign still stood at the town's entrance, but the population number had faded to illegibility, leaving only ghost impressions where the digits had once proclaimed the community's size to passing travelers. It was on a particularly cold night in late February when I discovered I wasn't the only one who had noticed the changes. As I pulled into Roadway Rest, my headlights swept across another big rig parked near the fuel pumps, its driver standing beside the cab and staring back toward Millbrook with an expression of bewildered concern. I recognized him as Tommy Valdez, a driver I'd crossed paths with many times over the years on various routes throughout the mountain states. "Tommy," I called out as I climbed down from my cab, my breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Everything all right?" He turned toward me and I could see confusion written across his weathered features. "Jake, thank God. Tell me you've noticed it too. Tell me I'm not losing my mind." "The town," I said, and he nodded immediately. "It's disappearing piece by piece. I've been driving through here for 8 years, and every trip there's less of it than before. But when I ask Sarah about it, she acts like it's always been this small, like the missing buildings never existed at all." We stood together in the cold, two men who made our living on the road, who prided ourselves on our knowledge of every mile and landmark, trying to make sense of something that defied rational explanation, The lights of what remained of Millbrook twinkled in the distance like a constellation that was slowly going dark, star by star. "I think we need to go into town," Tommy said finally. "Talk to some of the locals, see if anyone else remembers things the way we do." The walk into Millbrook took less than 10 minutes, though I remembered it being nearly a mile from roadway rest to the town center. Main Street stretched ahead of us, but where dozens of businesses had once lined both sides of the road, now only a handful remained. A small grocery store, a gas station, a few houses with snow-covered lawns, and the post office that somehow continued to serve a community that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. The grocery store was still open despite the late hour, its windows casting rectangles of warm light onto the snow-covered sidewalk. A bell chimed as we pushed through the door, and an elderly man behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle with eyes that seemed too knowing, too aware. "Help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight rasp of advanced years. "We're just passing through," I said. "Beautiful town you have here. The highway that remembers." From Marcus, the first time I heard Highway 47 groan beneath my 18-wheeler, I thought something was wrong with my suspension. The sound rose up through the cab like a deep, mournful sigh, as if the asphalt itself was breathing underneath my Kenworth's 40 tons of weight. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, crossing every major route between Seattle and Miami, but I'd never heard anything quite like that haunting moan that seemed to follow my tire treads for miles. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I first encountered that particular stretch of forgotten highway. The dispatcher had routed me through what he called a shortcut, a 70-mile ribbon of cracked blacktop that wound through the pine forests of northern Idaho, connecting two interstates and supposedly saving me 3 hours of driving time. The GPS showed it as a thin gray line on the digital map, unmarked by any designation except that simple number, 47. No towns, no truck stops, no emergency services for the entire length. Just forest and road and the promise of an early delivery. The October air was crisp and still as I turned onto the highway just past midnight, my diesel engine settling into its familiar rhythm. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating the weathered yellow center line and the towering walls of pine trees that pressed close to either side of the narrow road. The stars were brilliant overhead, unpolluted by city lights, and I rolled down the window slightly to let in the clean mountain air scented with evergreen and the distant promise of snow. That's when I first heard it, a low, resonant groaning that seemed to emanate from directly beneath my truck. The sound rose and fell with the rhythm of my wheels, as if the road was responding to my presence, acknowledging the weight of my passage with those deep, almost human-like sighs. I checked my mirrors, thinking perhaps another truck was approaching from behind with some mechanical issue, but the highway stretched empty in both directions, my taillights painting the asphalt red in the darkness. I pulled over at the next wide spot and performed my standard safety check, walking around the entire rig with my flashlight, examining the tires, the trailer connections, the suspension components. Everything appeared normal. No loose bolts, no unusual wear patterns, no obvious source for the strange sounds I'd been hearing. The forest around me was absolutely silent except for the gentle ticking of my cooling engine and the distant whisper of wind through the pine boughs high above. When I climbed back into the cab and resumed driving, the groaning began again almost immediately. It was deeper now, more pronounced, as if the road was waking up to my presence after a brief pause. The sound seemed to travel along the length of my trailer, starting from the front tires and rolling backward like a wave, culminating in a long, drawn-out moan that faded just as the next cycle began. I tried adjusting my speed, thinking perhaps it was some kind of resonance frequency issue, but the groaning persisted whether I drove 40 miles per hour or 60. As the miles accumulated on my odometer, I began to notice other peculiarities about Highway 47. The road surface itself seemed unusually dark, absorbing my headlight beams rather than reflecting them back with the typical bright glare of modern asphalt. The yellow center line appeared faded and worn, as if it hadn't been repainted in decades, and in some sections it seemed to waver slightly, creating an optical illusion that made it difficult to maintain perfect lane position. Most unsettling of all, I hadn't encountered a single reflector post, mile marker, or road sign since entering the highway. Just that endless ribbon of dark pavement disappearing into the forest ahead. The groaning beneath my wheels was becoming more complex now, developing what sounded almost like vocal qualities. Sometimes it resembled a sigh of exhaustion, other times a moan of pain or distress. I found myself listening intently, trying to discern patterns in the sounds, wondering if my imagination was simply running wild during the lonely hours of night driving. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that the road was actually responding to my truck's passage, as if the asphalt retained some kind of memory or consciousness that awakened under the pressure of my wheels. Around mile marker 30, though there had been no actual mile marker to confirm my estimate, the character of Highway 47 began to change. The road surface became rougher, more uneven, and my truck began to bounce and sway more noticeably. The groaning sounds intensified correspondingly, rising to what could only be described as wails of anguish. Through my windshield, I could see that the asphalt ahead appeared somehow different, darker, more organic looking, with a texture that seemed to shift and ripple in my headlight beams. I slowed to 40 miles per hour, then 30, as the road conditions continued to deteriorate. The pavement beneath my wheels now felt soft and yielding, almost spongy, and the groaning had evolved into something that sounded disturbingly like human voices crying out in distress. My truck's steering became sluggish and unresponsive, as if I was driving through thick mud rather than over solid asphalt. The engine had to work harder to maintain even reduced speed, and the temperature gauge began climbing toward the warning zone. That's when I saw the first of the impressions in the road surface. In the glow of my headlights, the asphalt ahead appeared to be marked with what looked like tire tracks, but these weren't the typical parallel lines left by passing vehicles. Instead, they were deep, permanent-looking indentations that seemed to have been pressed into the pavement when it was still soft, now preserved like fossils in stone. Some were clearly from large trucks like mine, but others appeared to be from passenger cars, motorcycles, even what looked like bicycle tires, all embedded in the road surface as if they had been trapped there. The groaning beneath my wheels reached a crescendo as I drove over these embedded tire tracks, and I realized with growing horror that the sounds weren't coming from my truck at all. They were rising from the road itself, from the deep impressions left by countless vehicles that had passed this way before me. Each track seemed to retain some echo of its maker's passage, a ghostly memory preserved in the dark asphalt, and my own wheels were somehow triggering these recorded sounds as they rolled over the ancient impressions. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to clear this section of highway and return to normal pavement, but my truck responded sluggishly, as if the road was actively resisting my attempts to leave. The steering wheel fought against my grip, trying to pull the vehicle toward the deepest of the embedded tracks, and I had to use considerable force to maintain my position in the center of the lane. The groaning sounds were now clearly recognizable as voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all crying out together in a chaos of anguish and desperation. Through my side window, I caught glimpses of movement in the forest, dark shapes flitting between the pine trees that seemed to pace my truck as I struggled forward. They moved with an unsettling synchronization, appearing and disappearing among the shadows, and I had the distinct impression that they were somehow connected to the voices trapped in the road beneath my wheels. The air inside the cab grew thick and oppressive, carrying a metallic taste that reminded me of old pennies and stagnant water. My speedometer showed 15 miles per hour and dropping, despite my foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared with effort, but the truck continued to slow as if moving against an increasingly powerful current. The embedded tire tracks were becoming more numerous now, overlapping and crisscrossing the pavement in a complex web of preserved impressions, and the cacophony of voices rising from beneath my wheels grew correspondingly louder and more desperate. Just as I feared my truck would come to a complete stop, trapped forever in that nightmarish stretch of conscious asphalt, I spotted something ahead that filled me with relief. A normal-looking section of highway, properly marked with reflectors and sporting a fresh yellow center line. I managed to coax a few more miles per hour from my struggling engine, and gradually, I felt the road's grip on my vehicle beginning to weaken. The transition was abrupt and startling. One moment I was fighting against the road's resistance, surrounded by the wailing voices of trapped travelers, and the next I was rolling smoothly over conventional pavement, my engine purring normally, the forest silent except for the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. I checked my mirrors and saw only the familiar sight of empty highway stretching behind me, brightly lit by my taillights with no sign of the dark, organic-looking pavement I had just escaped. I drove the remaining miles to the interstate in a daze, trying to process what I had experienced. When I finally reached the truck stop at the junction, I pulled into the parking area and sat in my cab for a long time, engine idling, hands shaking slightly as I replayed the events of the past hour. I considered reporting what I'd encountered to the State Highway Department, but what would I tell them? That highway. The mirror's memory. From Jake Sullivan, the thing about driving 18-wheelers for 23 years is that you learn to trust your mirrors more than your own eyes. They become extensions of yourself, these rectangular windows into the world behind you. And after 2 decades of watching the road unfold in reverse through silvered glass, you develop an almost supernatural awareness of what belongs in that reflected space and what doesn't. That's why I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the fire in my rearview mirror on that October night outside of Bakersfield. Even though the road behind me was nothing but empty darkness, I was running late on a delivery to Sacramento, pushing my old Kenworth harder than I probably should have been, when the autumn fog started rolling in thick from the valley. The kind of fog that swallows headlights whole and turns familiar highways into alien landscapes. I'd been driving this route for years, knew every curve and grade by heart. But fog has a way of making even the most traveled roads feel foreign and hostile. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, picking up nothing but fragments of distant conversations and the occasional burst of Spanish language music that would fade in and out like ghosts trying to communicate from some other frequency. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, sitting in the cup holder like a bitter reminder of how long I'd been on the road, and the steady rhythm of the engine was starting to have that hypnotic effect that every long-haul driver knows and fears. That's when I started checking my mirrors more frequently, using them as anchors to keep myself alert and focused on the task at hand. The left mirror showed nothing but fog-shrouded guardrail. The right mirror reflected the same endless gray void that had been following me for miles. But the rearview mirror, the center mirror that should have shown me the empty stretch of Highway 99 disappearing into the mist, was reflecting something else entirely. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks with distant lights. Maybe another truck running without proper clearance or a distant farmhouse with its windows lit against the night. The orange glow was faint, almost ethereal, dancing and flickering in a way that reminded me of candlelight or perhaps a campfire viewed through heavy smoke. I adjusted the mirror slightly, thinking maybe the angle was catching some reflection from my own instrument panel. But the glow remained constant, pulsing gently like a living thing breathing in the darkness behind me. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the Kenworth's engine respond with its familiar rumble, thinking that whatever was causing the reflection would fall behind and disappear into the fog. But the fire in the mirror grew brighter instead of dimmer, and I began to make out shapes within the flames. At first, they were nothing more than shadows dancing in the orange light. But as I watched with growing unease, they began to take on more definite forms. There were structures burning, what looked like houses or barns, their roof lines clearly visible against the night sky. Smoke billowed upward in thick black columns that seemed to move independently of any wind, twisting and turning like serpents made of ash and soot. The strangest part was the complete absence of any corresponding glow in my side mirrors or through my windshield. When I turned my head to look directly behind me, there was nothing but fog and darkness. The fire existed only in that center mirror, as if the glass itself was somehow tuned to a different frequency of reality, showing me events that were happening somewhere else, or perhaps someone else entirely. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white against the black leather, as the flames in the mirror continued to grow in intensity and detail. The fire was spreading now, and I could see figures moving through the smoke. They were too distant and indistinct to make out clearly, but their movements had an urgent, panicked quality that made my chest tighten with sympathetic fear. Some were running, their forms silhouetted against the growing inferno, while others seemed to be carrying things, perhaps belongings or maybe other people. The scene had the quality of a historical photograph, sepia-toned and grainy, as if I were witnessing something from long ago, rather than something happening in real time. As the miles passed beneath my wheels, the fire in the mirror began to take on an almost hypnotic quality. I found myself checking it more and more frequently, drawn to the drama unfolding in that reflected world like a moth to flame. The burning seemed to follow a pattern, starting with individual structures and then spreading outward in concentric circles of destruction. There was something deliberate about it, something that suggested this wasn't a natural disaster or an accident, but something far more sinister and intentional. The fog around my truck began to thin as I climbed a long grade, and for a moment I thought the approaching dawn might bring some clarity to the situation. But instead of dissipating, the fire in the mirror grew even more vivid and detailed. I could now make out faces in the fleeing figures, expressions of terror and desperation that seemed to look directly at me through the glass. Their mouths were open as if screaming, but no sound penetrated the cab of my truck. It was like watching a silent movie of someone else's nightmare, and I was becoming increasingly convinced that what I was seeing wasn't happening in the present at all. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow when I recognized one of the burning buildings in the mirror. It was the old Morrison farmhouse, a structure that had been demolished 15 years ago to make way for a shopping center. I knew this because I had grown up less than 5 miles from that farm, had played in its abandoned barn as a child, and had watched sadly as the wrecking ball reduced it to rubble in 1993. But there it was in my rearview mirror, burning bright against the night sky, surrounded by other buildings I remembered from my childhood, all of them engulfed in flames that cast dancing shadows across the faces of people I was beginning to recognize. Hands started trembling on the steering wheel as more familiar faces emerged from the smoke in the mirror. There was Mrs. Henderson from the corner store, her gray hair wild and her floral dress singed black around the edges. Behind her ran Tommy Martinez, who used to deliver our mail until he died of a heart attack in 1997. They were all there, all the people from my childhood town of Cedar Falls, all of them fleeing from something terrible that was consuming everything they had ever known or loved. The fire was spreading faster now, leaping from building to building with an intelligence and malevolence that defied natural law. I watched in growing horror as the flames reached the old Methodist church where my family had attended services every Sunday for 20 years. The white steeple collapsed in on itself, sending a shower of sparks high into the night sky, and I could swear I heard the distant sound of screams even though my radio was silent and my windows were rolled up tight against the fog. That's when I realized with dawning terror that the fire in the mirror wasn't showing me something that had happened 15 years ago. It was showing me something that was happening now, in some version of reality where Cedar Falls had never been demolished. where the people I had grown up with were still alive and still living their lives in the shadow of some approaching catastrophe. And somehow, through the medium of my rearview mirror, I was being forced to witness their destruction all over again. The fog around my truck began to clear completely, and I could see the lights of Sacramento glowing in the distance like a false dawn on the horizon. But the fire in the mirror was reaching its crescendo, and I could see that the flames were now consuming the very edges of the reflected image itself. The fire was burning through whatever barrier separated their world from mine, eating away at the silvered glass like acid on metal. Cracks began to appear in the mirror's surface, spiderwebbing outward from the center where the flames burned brightest. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, feeling the Kenworth surge forward with desperate speed, but I knew with growing certainty that I couldn't outrun whatever was happening behind me. The fire in the mirror was no longer content to remain a reflection. It was becoming real, bleeding through into my world through the medium of silvered glass and traumatic memory. The temperature in my cab began to rise, and I could smell smoke seeping in through the ventilation system. Just as the flames in the mirror reached the very edges of the glass and began to spill out into the real world, I spotted a truck stop ahead, its neon lights cutting through the last wisps of fog like a beacon of salvation. I downshifted hard, feeling the engine brake engage, and pulled into the parking lot with a screech of air brakes and burning rubber. The moment my truck came to a complete stop, I leaped from the cab and ran around to look at the back of my trailer. There was nothing there but empty highway and the first pale light of dawn creeping over the mountains to the east. No fire, no smoke, no burning buildings from a town that had been destroyed 15 years ago. But when I walked back to the front of my truck and looked up at my rearview mirror, I could see that the glass was cracked in a perfect starburst pattern. Sweet dreams at mile marker 237. From Jake Morrison. The first thing I noticed about the fuel wasn't the color, though that pale amber glow should have been warning enough. It wasn't even the way it seemed to move with its own current in the underground tanks, creating patterns that reminded me of honey dripping upward. No, what caught my attention first was the smell drifting up from the pump nozzle when I pulled it from its cradle that humid August night, somewhere deep in the Georgia pines. It smelled like birthday cake and cotton candy, like every county fair I'd ever been to as a kid. Sweet enough to make my mouth water even though I knew better than to get that close to petroleum products. I'd been driving the same route from Atlanta to Jacksonville for 3 years, hauling refrigerated produce in my Peterbilt 379, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every fuel station, every mom and pop diner between the two cities. But this place, nestled between mile markers 237 and 238 on a stretch of highway I could usually navigate blindfolded, felt both familiar and completely alien. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting that sickly blue-white glow that made everything look like it was underwater, and the lettering read, "Sweet Dreams Fuel," in cursive script that belonged more on a bakery window than a truck stop. The rain had started about an hour earlier, one of those sudden Georgia downpours that turns the asphalt into a mirror and makes the whole world seem to shimmer and bend. Water drummed against my windshield in a steady rhythm that had started to lull me toward the dangerous edge of highway hypnosis, and my fuel gauge needle had been dancing around the quarter tank mark for the last 20 miles. When I spotted the sweet yellow glow of the station lights bleeding through the rain and pine trees, it felt like salvation, even though something in the back of my mind whispered that I'd never seen this place before. The parking lot was empty except for my rig, which wasn't unusual for a Wednesday night at 2 a.m. But the silence felt heavier than it should have. Even in the rain, you usually hear something at these places. The hum of electrical transformers, the distant rush of traffic, maybe a radio playing from the cashier booth. Here, the only sound was the rain pattering against my cab, and the soft whisper of wind through the pine boughs that seemed to lean in too close to the station's perimeter. I climbed down from the cab, pulled my collar up against the rain, and made my way to the diesel pumps. The pavement beneath my feet felt strange, almost spongy, as if the concrete hadn't quite cured properly, though the station looked old enough that any concrete should have been settled for years. The pump itself was an older model, one of those heavy mechanical units from the 80s, but it had been maintained with an almost obsessive care that made every surface gleam, despite the dim lighting. That's when I caught the scent rising from the nozzle, that impossibly sweet fragrance that made me think of childhood summers and carnival rides. Against every regulation I'd ever learned, every safety protocol drilled into my head during 22 years of professional driving, I found myself leaning closer to breathe it in. It reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, all vanilla and brown sugar and promises of something wonderful waiting just around the corner. The fuel flowed differently, too. I noticed as I squeezed the trigger and listened to it rush through the hose into my tank. Instead of the harsh mechanical sound of diesel flowing through metal, it moved with an almost musical quality, like water running over smooth stones or wind chimes singing in a gentle breeze. The amber liquid caught the station lights as it flowed, creating swirls and patterns that seemed too deliberate to be random, too beautiful to be ordinary truck fuel. I should have been paying attention to the pump display, watching the gallons tick by and calculating what this fill-up would cost. But I found myself mesmerized by the flowing fuel visible through the transparent section of the nozzle handle. It moved like liquid light, like captured sunshine, and I could swear I saw shapes forming in the flow. Faces that looked familiar but just out of reach of memory. Places that felt like home even though I'd never seen them before. The pump clicked off at exactly 40 gallons, though my tank should have taken at least 60 to fill from a quarter level. I squeezed the trigger again, but nothing came. The display showed 40 gallons at $2.18 per gallon, which was impossibly cheap for diesel even back then. I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them, when I noticed that the rain had stopped without my realizing it, and the silence had become so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Walking toward the cashier booth, I noticed details that had escaped me in the rain. The way the building's siding seemed to shimmer between white and pale yellow depending on the angle. How the windows reflected not the parking lot behind me, but images of roads I'd never traveled, landscapes that existed somewhere between memory and dream. The door chimed when I pushed it open, but the sound was more like distant church bells than the harsh buzzer typical of truck stops. Behind the counter sat a woman who might have been 30 or 60, with silver hair that caught the fluorescent lights like spun metal, and eyes the same pale amber as the fuel I just pumped. She smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that reaches all the way to the eyes and makes you feel like you've just come home after a long journey. Her name tag read Dolores in the same flowing script as the station sign, and when she spoke, her voice carried the faint trace of an accent I couldn't quite place. 40 gallons on pump 3, she said before I could speak, and her voice had the same musical quality as the fuel flowing through the hose. That'll be 87.20, honey. How's the road treating you tonight? She moved with careful precision, every gesture economical and graceful, as if she were performing a ritual she'd done thousands of times before. I handed her my company credit card and tried to make small talk about the weather, the road conditions, how long the station had been there, but her answers seemed to drift around the edges of my questions without ever quite landing on solid ground. She mentioned that Sweet Dreams Fuel had been serving travelers for as long as anyone could remember, and that their fuel was specially formulated for long-distance drivers who needed to stay alert and focused. When I asked about the unusual smell and color, she just smiled that warm smile and said that was their proprietary blend of additives designed to optimize engine performance and driver satisfaction. As she ran my card, I noticed that the convenience store shelves were stocked with items that seemed both familiar and subtly wrong. Candy bars with names I almost recognized, soft drinks in colors that didn't quite exist in nature, magazines with dates that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, The whole place felt like a memory of a truck stop rather than an actual truck stop, as if someone had tried to recreate the experience from second-hand descriptions. The transaction completed, Dolores handed me my receipt with another of those warming smiles. "Drive safe out there," she said, and her amber eyes seemed to hold depths that went far beyond what should have been possible. "Sweet dreams, and remember us when you need fuel again. We'll be here whenever you need us most." There was something in her tone that suggested a promise and a warning, wrapped into one gentle phrase. Back in my cab, I studied the receipt under the dome light. The numbers were all correct, but the paper felt strange in my hands, almost warm to the touch, and the ink seemed to shimmer slightly as if it were still wet. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my logbook, then fired up the Peterbilt and pulled back onto the highway, leaving Sweet Dreams fuel glowing softly in my mirrors until the pine trees swallowed it completely. The engine ran smoother than it had in months, purring with a contentment that made the whole cab vibrate with satisfaction. My fuel gauge read completely full, despite having taken only 40 gallons into a nearly empty tank. And the rain had started again, drumming against my windshield in that same hypnotic rhythm that had been lulling me towards sleep before my stop. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake some nights. I never did get sleepy on the rest of that run. Not even a little bit. I drove straight through to Jacksonville feeling more alert and focused than I had in years, as if that strange amber fuel was feeding not just my engine but something in me as well. Every mile marker was crystal clear. Every road sign stood out in perfect detail, and I could swear that the world around me looked somehow more vibrant than it had before my stop at Sweet Dreams Fuel. I've driven that same stretch of highway dozens of times since that night, always watching for mile markers 237 and 238, always hoping to catch another glimpse of those yellow lights bleeding through the Georgia pines. The voice in the mist. From Marcus Chen, the fog rolled in like liquid mercury across Highway 101, transforming the familiar stretch of Oregon coast into something alien and hostile. I'd been driving this route for 12 years, hauling timber from the mills in Coos Bay to the distribution centers in Portland, but I'd never seen anything quite like this. The mist wasn't the usual Pacific marine layer that crept in gentle and predictable. This fog moved with purpose, flowing across the asphalt in thick, churning waves that seemed to swallow the yellow centerline whole. My Freightliner's headlights barely penetrated 10 feet into the gray wall ahead, and I found myself leaning forward against the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield as if those extra inches might somehow grant me better vision. The radio had gone to static 20 miles back, leaving only the steady rumble of my diesel engine and the occasional ping of cooling metal to keep me company. The fog pressed against the cab windows like curious fingers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for something. I'd left the mill 3 hours behind schedule because of a paperwork mix-up, and now this weather was going to make me even later. The dispatcher at Northwest Freight wouldn't be happy, but there wasn't much I could do except keep rolling at a cautious 30 miles per hour and hope the fog would thin out as I climbed toward the Coast Range. The familiar landmarks had all disappeared. The roadside diner with its neon sign, the turnoff to Whiskey Creek, even the towering Douglas firs that normally lined this section of highway. Everything had been erased by the creeping gray. That's when I first heard it, soft and almost lost beneath the engine noise. A voice distant and muffled seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I reached over and turned down the radio, even though it was already crackling with nothing but dead air, and listened more carefully. There it was again, carried on some unfelt breeze that made the fog swirl in lazy spirals just beyond my headlight beams. The words were unclear, like someone calling from far away, but there was something familiar about the cadence, the rhythm of speech. I rolled down the driver's side window a few inches, letting in a tendril of cool, damp air that smelled of salt and seaweed and something else, something organic and earthy, like mushrooms growing in dark places. The voice became clearer then, though still frustratingly indistinct, as if the fog itself was speaking in whispers. I found myself slowing down even more, my foot easing off the accelerator as I strained to make out the words. The logical part of my mind insisted it was just wind moving through the trees, or maybe the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore below. But something deeper and more primitive was raising alarm bells. The fog seemed to be thickening rather than clearing, and now it was beginning to take on shapes, vague outlines that formed and dissolved before I could quite focus on them. A face here, a reaching hand there, figures that appeared to be walking alongside the truck before melting back into the gray anonymity. I'd heard of pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns and faces in random shapes, but this felt different. These forms seemed deliberate, intentional, as if the mist was deliberately trying to show me something. Then the voice spoke clearly, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was my own voice, unmistakably mine, calling out from somewhere in the fog ahead, not an echo or a distortion, but the exact timbre and tone I heard every morning when I called my wife before starting my route. The words chilled me more than the damp night air seeping through the window crack. "Marcus," my own voice called from the gray wall ahead. "Marcus, pull over. You need to stop." My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror as if I might somehow see myself standing on the road behind the truck. But there was nothing visible except more fog, rolling and churning in patterns that defied the still air. The voice, my voice, came again, closer this time, as if the speaker was walking alongside the cab. "You can't keep running from what you did," it said, and the words carried a weight of knowledge that made my stomach clench with old guilt. "Stop the truck, Marcus. It's time to face what happened." I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the Freightliner up to 40 despite the limited visibility. The fog swirled faster around the truck, and now I could hear multiple voices, all variations of my own, speaking from different directions. Some were whispering, others speaking in normal conversational tones, and a few were calling out as if from a great distance. They all seemed to know things they shouldn't know, secrets I'd never shared with another soul. "Remember the accident in Nevada?" one voice said from the passenger side window. "The family in the minivan. You never reported the loose tie-down that caused the load shift. What about the logbook violations?" another asked from somewhere above the cab. "All those hours you've been falsifying. Someone could have been killed. And Sarah," a third voice whispered, so close it seemed to be coming from inside the cab itself. "You never told her about Phoenix, did you? About what happened at that truck stop?" Each accusation hit like a physical blow, dredging up memories and mistakes I'd spent years trying to forget or rationalize. The fog pressed closer against the windshield, and I realized with growing horror that it was forming shapes that looked disturbingly like faces. My face, but wrong somehow, twisted into expressions of accusation and disappointment. The temperature inside the cab seemed to be dropping, and my breath was beginning to fog despite the heater running full blast. The voices were getting louder now, more insistent, and they seemed to be coming from all directions at once. The fog had become so thick that I couldn't see beyond the truck's hood, and I was driving purely on instinct, trying to keep the wheels somewhere near where I thought the center line should be. The highway curved gently through this section, following the contours of the coastline, but I'd lost all sense of direction and position. "Pull over," Marcus and the voices chorused together, creating a sound like a twisted church choir. "Stop fighting it. You know you deserve whatever's coming." But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I'd survived worse than fog and voices, real dangers like black ice in the Rockies and dust storms in Arizona. I reached for the CB radio, thinking maybe I could raise another driver or the highway patrol. But when I keyed the mic, my own voice came crackling back through the speaker, distorted and strange. "Breaker 19, this is the guilt you've been carrying," it said with a sound like static-filled laughter. "Better pull that big rig over before someone gets hurt." That's when I saw the lights ahead, barely visible through the fog, but definitely there, the familiar pattern of running lights on another semi. Relief flooded through me as I realized I wasn't alone on this nightmare stretch of highway. I flashed my high beams and reached for the air horn, but as I got closer, the relief transformed into a new kind of terror. The truck ahead looked exactly like mine. Same model Freightliner, same blue and chrome paint job, same company logo on the trailer doors. Even the license plates were identical, which was impossible since I was looking at my own truck from behind. The fog swirled around both vehicles, and I could see a figure in the driver's seat of the truck ahead. But when he turned to look back at me through his rear window, I was staring at my own face. The other me smiled and waved, then began to slow down, forcing me to brake as well. The fog closed in tighter, and now I could see dozens of trucks surrounding us, all identical, all driven by versions of myself. They formed a convoy moving through the gray nothing, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I was no longer on Highway 101. I wasn't sure I was anywhere that existed on any map. The voices of all my other selves filled the air, speaking in unison now, their words carrying the weight of every mistake, every shortcut, every moment of moral compromise that had brought me to this place. The fog had become a court of judgment, with myself as both prosecutor and jury, and the verdict was already written in the swirling gray faces that pressed against every window of the cab. But then, cutting through the supernatural chorus, I heard something else. The distant wail of a foghorn from the coast, real and solid and anchored to the world I knew. I cranked the steering wheel hard to the right, breaking away from the convoy of impossible trucks, and gunned the engine toward that sound. The fog fought me, seeming to grab at the trailer with invisible hands, and the voices rose to a shriek of frustration and rage.